Is the Bible perfect? Is the Bible a representation of God in his divinity and his purity? Or is it like any other book where it has truth and untruth and you have to sort out which is which? I have spent over a year now reading and researching and thinking about this topic. And I can now confidently say that I'm pretty sure that you owe me 20 bucks. Giving preamble is for the weak, and I'm going to now give more preamble. And look at this PowerPoint. Look at that slide. Woo! So the goal of this, because I am going to have to give a little bit of preamble, but I'm going to go through this quick because I just want to get to the stuff. The goal is to demonstrate that there are not just differences, but that there are contradictions between the 4 different gospel accounts in the 4 different gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So not just that there are differences, but there are things between them that cannot be true at the same time. This argument cannot and should not be used to disprove any sort of faith. Christianity is not inerrancy. If there are contradictions in the Bible, that doesn't speak to whether or not there is or is not a certain God. And I don't want there to be any misconception around that being the goal. The goal is just to show that there are contradictions in the text itself, that there is something in the text that is not perfect. With that, I'm going to try super hard. I love how the slides look. I'm going to try super hard not to get into definitions too much, but really, really quickly, just on contradiction and inerrancy. Let's just quickly define those two. A contradiction, and this has it has a more complicated definition than I'd like it to, but generally we would say that a contradiction is when 2 things cannot be true at the same time in the same passage or account or 2 details. So if I was to say that I am asleep and that I am awake at the same time, assuming I mean the same thing, that those two would not be true at the same time then. One of those 2 must contradict. And when we talk about inerrancy is just the idea that the Bible is perfect and without flaw. So if the Bible is inerrant, that means that there's nothing in it that is wrong. This video is divided into layers. And these layers are just ways to think of like the different levels of depth in the topic. Because I worry that this video, I don't know how exactly long it's going to be, but I worry it's going to be maybe over 2 or 3 hours long, and I do not want it to be. But for those who are not 2 to 3 hours long interested in a topic, I've got this chunked up into these layers. So layer 1 is the basics. That's the 4 passages of the 4 Gospels. It's the contradictions and differences that I see between them. It's the ways that people argue that those are not actually contradictions, different ways that people harmonize it. And then finally, it's the ways that I don't think that those contradictions work. So deharmonizing it, so to speak. That's the basics. And then moving on to layer 2, we're applying those general ideas. So in layer 1, we're being very broad. We're covering general arguments and ideas. Layer 2 is taking the specific work of a specific guy. John Wenham wrote a book called The Easter Enigma in 19... And in that book, he covers a lot of the different arguments around the resurrection stories. And we're going to go over the parts of his book that are relevant to the arguments of this video. And we're going to cover the different contradictions. We're going to cover in depth, in full quotation, the things that he says about it. And then we're going to in depth cover responses to those ideas. Layer 3 is very much the exact same thing, but continuing to apply that same level of thoroughness with different authors and speakers. So we're no longer just talking about John Wenham. We're going to take different authors who are, biblical scholars, they're commentators, they're apologists. We're going to quote them in full, in depth, and then we're going to respond in full. So we got all the big names. We already had John Wenham. We got Bruce Metzger. We got Richard Bauckham. We got Michael Licona. All the big names will be in level 3. And then layer 4 is notable details. So layer 3 will be a very long section. That's covering people in depth thoroughly. Level 4 is the exact opposite of that. In that layer, we're just covering little snippets of things people said that are notable. Maybe a certain commentary wasn't worth going over in full, but maybe there's something in it that is interesting and worth talking about. So layer 4 will be very, very brief. And then layer 5 is listed here, the appendices. We are not going to cover the appendices at all in this video. There will be a link in the description to the document. We'll get to that more in a second, but the appendices are just chunks of information that are worth noting and need to be there in some sense, but are not worth covering in full for nearly anyone. So for example, there's one of the appendices is just listing every time in the book of Matthew that the Greek word translated behold is used. That needs to be there because it's relevant to a certain argument. nobody cares about every single use of the word behold, and it would be a waste of time to cover that generally. So it's there, and it can be viewed, and it can be accessed, but we're not going to get into that here. Let's move on to final notes. So I'll try to keep this very, very brief. One, all verses are ESV. It's not because ESV is the best or the worst. It's just the ESV is a generally fairly literal translation that a lot of people like. So that's just for consistency across the board. Everything's going to be ESV. Second note here is that the long ending of Mark is excluded. The ending of Mark either ends at chapter 16, verse 20, or chapter 16, verse 8. For the purposes of this document, the long endings of Mark are excluded, and the passage ends at 16:8. There is contention on whether or not Mark is meant to end where it does, but there is widespread consensus that the longer endings that are currently accessible are not from the original author. I'll link 2 Christian articles that discuss the topic here. With that, the third note I have here for myself is that the document contains all sources. In this description, there will be a Google document that this video and this beautiful PowerPoint is based on, and that document is everything sourced. So it goes through all the same basic outline pieces, and then anything that's cited, anything that's claimed in there is immediately sourced. So if you want to see the articles about the long ending of Mark or anything else, it will always be hyperlinked in that document. And so that might be helpful to follow along or just to check something if you're not sure about a certain claim. And then finally, timestamps. This video, again, is going to be quite long. There are the different layers. If you look in the description or along the progress bar at the bottom of the video, if you're watching on a computer or a tablet or a phone, there will be timestamps showing all of the different layers and then closing thoughts at the end. So if you're curious about this, but you don't want to watch the whole thing, which I don't either. But if you just want to watch the brief gist of it, you could just watch layer 1, the basics, and then you could skip at the end and watch the closing thoughts, which are also relevant, but watch whatever you want to. But those are those final thoughts. And then with that, let's get into layer 1. Let's get into the basics. Starting off, we're just going to read the 4 passages. We're going to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we're just going to read it in full. So buckle up, because this is just going to be reading for a second. Starting with Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. Now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is coming before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." Reading now from Mark 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices, so they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, reading from Luke 24, verses 1 through 12. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb, and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking spices they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living amongst the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise." And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. Finally, we're going to read from John 20, verses 1 through 18. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. So there are the passages from the 4 different Gospels, and with that, we're going to get into the branches. These are the things that I think are differences that are worth noting between the 4 Gospels, but I'm not going to argue that these are contradictions. These are just things that I think are notable to help sort of flesh out the differences that we notice between the 4 passages, starting with the different reports of who went to the tomb. In Matthew, it's described as Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. In Mark, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome. In Luke, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, Joanna, and others. And in John, it's Mary Magdalene, and she's the only one mentioned, but there's the implication that there are other women there. So the way that John reads is, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb. That sounds like it's just her. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we, plural, do not know where they have laid him." And that makes it sound like there were other people with her. So it could just be Mary, it could be others. It's not necessarily important here. The important thing to note is that there are different women and different numbers of women named in different accounts. And again, this doesn't necessarily contradict, different authors might just be highlighting different people, but it's worth noting as a distinction between the 4 different accounts. Next is the difference between how many angels were seen and how they're described. This is very brief. In Matthew, it says that there was 1 angel. In Mark, it says there was 1 young man. In Luke, it says there was 2 men. And in John, it says there was 2 angels. I don't think this necessarily matters. It's worth noting, certainly, the difference between 1 and 2 angels. It doesn't mean that they disagree, but it is notable that, different authors are describing them as angels versus men, and then some only say that there was an angel at the tomb and others say there were 2. Next is the differing messages delivered by the angels. This one's a little bit more in depth, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on this, and we're going to read each in full, because there are some that are very, very similar, and then there's some that have significant distinctions. So starting with Matthew and Mark are very similar. They're like light paraphrases of each other. In Matthew, the angel says, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." Moving to Mark, it says, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Between these two, there are two differences I think are worth noting because otherwise they're very, very similar. One, I don't know if this is important, but I think it is interesting and maybe kind of funny that in Matthew it says, "Go tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead." In Mark it says, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee." I just think it's funny that Peter is sort of narrowed out there. And then the difference I think is probably more notable is that in Matthew it ends with, "There you will see him, see I have told you." And in Mark, it ends with, "There you will see him just as he told you." And that stands out to me as a bit more of a noteworthy difference. It's not a very big one, but it does seem like two different meanings. It's not just wording. Those are two different things being said. Moving on to Luke. Luke says, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise." The big difference here is that Galilee is still mentioned, but Galilee is no longer a place that they are told to go. All three of these passages so far mention Galilee, but in Mark and Matthew, both of them are on the same page where it's saying, "Hey, he's not here. He is risen. Go to Galilee. You're going to see him there." Luke takes Galilee a different direction. It doesn't actually have any call for the disciples to go anywhere, and instead says, "Hey, remember back when you were in Galilee, Jesus said this thing to you." And then finally, John is very, very different. For one thing, of course, the angels in John are appearing in a very different way. Mary has already come to the tomb and then left, and she's come back after Peter and John have checked. But in that instance, while she's weeping at the tomb, the angels say, "Why are you weeping?" And that's all they say. So obviously very different. We'll get to that part of it a little bit more later, but right now I just wanted to note the distinctions between those four different messages. And with those branches out of the way, now we get to our contradictions. These are those places where only one of the two things can be true at the same time. They don't just have differences, but they actually disagree with each other. We have four of these contradictions we're going to cover, and we're going to go through them relatively simple and relatively fast. Starting off with the disagreement on where Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. And this contradiction is only between Matthew and John because they're the only two accounts that actually depict Jesus appearing to Mary. Did Jesus appear to Mary Magdalene after she had gone to the tomb, found an angel there with a divine message, and while she was running back to tell the disciples? Or did Jesus appear to Mary after she had gone to the tomb, found it empty with no angels there, gone to tell others, and after she had returned to the tomb a second time while she was at the tomb? These two things cannot be true at the same time. Jesus is appearing to Mary in two different places, in two different ways, surrounded by two different series of events. It's either the tomb had angels in it or didn't, divine message, or there wasn't. She saw him at her first visit to the tomb or second. These two things cannot agree at the same time. Second is the clashing appearances of the angels. When the women went to the tomb, did they find an angel outside the tomb, sitting on the tombstone? Or did they only see an angel or angels once they went into the tomb? Or did they see no angels at all because there were no angels there when they discovered the tomb empty and they first went there for the first time? When Mary goes to the tomb in Matthew, there is an angel there who has descended from heaven and rolled back the stone and sat on it and blinded the guards. In Mark and Luke alike, there are angels to some capacity, one or two sitting or standing inside of the tomb, and the women only see those angels once they go in. And then of course in John, when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, it's empty and she sees no angels and no appearance at all. Third is the disagreement on who the women spoke to. When the women went to the tomb and found it empty and saw whatever it is they saw, did they go and tell others, including the disciples, what they saw, or did they say nothing to anyone? This is a pretty big disagreement. In both Luke and John, the women go tell to some capacity about whatever they saw, even if the contents of those messages are different. Matthew doesn't say one way or the other, but in Mark specifically, the passage ends by saying, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Mark cannot work alongside Luke and John. The women cannot have both delivered the message of the angel and whatever else they saw at the tomb, and have said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Finally, we have the disagreement on what it is that the women shared, what the content of their message was. We understand part of this already because Mark says that the women said nothing to anyone. So we understand how that might clash. But we also have a bit of a fight between Luke and John. After the women have discovered the tomb to be empty, after that first passage to the tomb, in Luke, the women tell of angels and their divine message of Christ being resurrected. And in John, Mary simply says, "They have taken our Lord from the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So, did the women deliver a message of angels at the tomb and a divine message? Did they deliver a message of there being an empty tomb and Jesus being gone, not knowing where he is, but no mention of angels or any sort of divinity? Or did the women say nothing to anyone because they were afraid? And with that, those are the four big contradictions we want to focus on. Where did Jesus appear to Mary Magdalene? Where did the angels appear to the women? Did the women share a message? And if they did, what message did they share? And with that, let's get to harmonizing. Harmonizing is a word that is often used to describe trying to make the different accounts of maybe troublesome Bible verses, or really any sort of text or passage, mesh with each other when they seem like they might not. So harmonizing is taking two different accounts and making them work together. And this section, I've labeled it harmonizing and deharmonizing. For the purposes of this basics layer, this is going to be a very brief summary of some of the defenses against the idea of contradiction in these four gospel accounts, and then I'm going to respond to those in very brief and express why I don't believe that those arguments work. Now, in this section, we're not citing or quoting arguments in detail or saying who made them, but every argument that is made in this section will be elaborated on later, quoting somebody who makes that argument in full. Resolving the appearances of Jesus to Mary. Did Jesus appear to Mary on the road after witnessing angels at the tomb, or back at the tomb after having gone back and forth and seen no divine message and no angels at the tomb? What we could say to make these work is to actually say that there were two appearances of Jesus, but they weren't both to Mary Magdalene. Only one of them was. So what we would say is that when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb with these other women, once she saw it was empty, she ran away immediately, leaving the other women at the tomb. And so she goes and tells Peter and John come and check. And then later, after Peter and John have left, then Mary Magdalene has her appearance of Jesus to her at the tomb. The appearance in Matthew isn't to Mary Magdalene, it's to those other women who stayed behind. Whenever Mary Magdalene ran away to tell Peter and John, those other women stayed behind. They heard of the angels, they heard the angel's divine message, and then as they were running back to tell the disciples, they had Jesus appear to them. And in that way, those two narratives are harmonized because they don't work together, but that's because they're not trying to describe the same event. Only one of them is Mary Magdalene. These are two different appearances of Jesus to two different groups of people. The reason I don't think this argument works is because Mary Magdalene is firmly placed as present in both Matthew and Luke. And let's go over both of those very quickly. These bubbles on screen look a little bit scary, but all that they're meant to signify is showing you where the plurals are in this passage. So when Matthew starts his story, he names two women, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And after introducing them, he continues to refer to them in the plural throughout the story. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb, but the angel said to the women, plural, "Do not be afraid, see, I've told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, ran to tell his disciples, and behold, Jesus met them. So our narrator, the author, is naming only two women and then continuing to refer to them in the plural, setting aside the fact that he doesn't even mention Mary Magdalene running off from the tomb immediately, which you think would be important for your main character or the main person being highlighted in this passage. He also precludes the idea of suggesting that she off-screen left and leaving the other Mary behind, because if so, he would have switched to using the singular. Then Jesus appeared to her and just one woman. So in Matthew, Mary Magdalene is there through the series of events, including the appearance of Jesus. And I want to back this up by reading what Luke says as well. So after describing the appearances of the angels and their message to the women, Luke says, quote, "Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles." So he describes the events in question and then says it was these women who told those things to the apostles. So Mary Magdalene is one of the women who delivered the message of angels at the tomb, which precludes the idea that she ran off right away. Contradiction 2 was the different appearances of the angels. Was there an angel outside the tomb sitting on the stone? Were there angels that were only seen once the women were inside the tomb? Or were there no angels at all? Part of this we can harmonize by saying that Matthew's account actually doesn't disagree with Mark and Luke. In Matthew's account, it sounds like the angel is sitting on top of the tombstone, but actually this is just Matthew writing things a little bit out of order. So when Matthew says, Now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Then he says, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. When he makes that switch to, now behold, there was a great earthquake, the author of Matthew is now jumping back to things that happened before the women actually got to the tomb. So he's writing things a little bit unchronologically. So the way that we could read this instead is to say, the women went to the tomb, and behold, an angel had descended from heaven earlier and rolled back the stone and had been sitting on it. And then he said to the women, in theory, now once within the tomb, all the things that he had to deliver. And to harmonize John's account, where there's no angels at the tomb initially, we could actually use the same argument we used for contradiction 1. Mary Magdalene ran away as soon as she saw that the tomb was empty, leaving the other women there. So John is describing what Mary Magdalene saw, and all that Mary Magdalene saw was that the tomb was empty. She didn't see the angels, she didn't hear the message. So that's why they're not listed in John on that first appearance, is because Mary Magdalene didn't see them. There's 3 reasons I want to emphasize that I don't think this works. We're going to go through them very quickly: general format, word use, and tense use. Starting with general format, I just want to note how this passage reads. The women go to the tomb, an angel rolls back and sits on the stone, and then he says to the women the things he has to say. Now, this is a weak argument because we're just kind of arguing based on the plain text reading of the passage, which is not, the best way to figure out how things happen, but it's worth noting because unless you were looking to harmonize something, you would never read this passage with the idea of, oh, these are things that happened earlier before the women arrived. You would read it as, these are things that are happening in front of the women. So I'm just going to read the passage again very quickly. Matthew says, quote, now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, etc., etc. This does not read at all like events out of chronology. The second argument I want to note is the words that are being used by the author of Matthew. This gets elaborated on in one of the appendices that's in the document. You can check that for more evidence and backing of this. But there's this word used here, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven. That word behold is used a lot by the author of Matthew. And when the narrator is using it to describe his order of events, it is almost always, in almost every single case, describing the next event that happens in order to the same people that we've been covering. So the author using this word, describing the transition from talking about the women coming to the tomb to talking about the angel descending, most likely indicates that the author is seeking to describe a thing that happened next in order, in time, to the same people, the women going to the tomb. And again, if you want to check, that's linked in the document. You can check out every case that's used by, every time the author of Matthew uses that word behold, and see for yourself. But if we're to go off of the common usage of these words by the author, this is describing the next thing in order, not something that happened earlier. The final argument is tense use, and this is the densest one, but we're still going to go through it relatively quickly. I have on screen here the passage, and I've put in bold every time that the aorist tense in Greek is used. You don't need to know much about the aorist tense here, just that it's a relatively generic Greek verb tense that can often be used to describe past tense events. It's used a lot in narratives. I'm going to read what's said by the Ezra Project here. The Ezra Project is a Christian organization that tries to encourage biblical reading, and they say, quote, aorist is the default tense, especially when a writer is describing the past. If in doubt, Greeks would use aorist. If you see any other tense, you should suspect that it was used deliberately to make a point, end quote. So you'll note almost every verb in this passage is in the aorist tense, which is this generic past tense verb. Not every verb, though, and that's what we're going to get to next. So on this next slide, I have only 2 verbs in bold. It's when the angel sat on the stone and his appearance being described as his appearance was like lightning. These are the 2 verbs in this passage that are not in the aorist tense. They are in the imperfect tense, and the imperfect tense is used to describe things that are not just things that happened and have completed. They are ongoing, incomplete, continuous events. Again, reading from the Ezra Project, quote, the imperfect tense is the ideal way to describe an action that was in the process of happening at some point in the past, end quote. When we look at this passage in Matthew, there's this generic tense being used almost all the time, but it's not being used when the angel sits on the stone and describing his appearance. which suggests that these parts of the narrative, at the very least these parts, are things that were ongoing and continuous and incomplete, which is to say that we have evidence not just that the author used words to describe, the word behold indicating this is the next event in order, he's also giving us tenses that are very specifically used, as Ezra Project notes, it goes out of our way to pick this tense to describe things that were continuing to happen. The angel didn't just sit on the stone, he was continuing to sit on the stone when he spoke to the women. Next is resolving who the women told. Did the women go tell the disciples what they saw at the tomb, like described in Luke and John, or did the women say nothing to anyone because they were afraid, like described in Mark? Our solution here, very broadly, is to say that Mark doesn't actually intend for you to take away that the women said nothing to anyone, just that the women didn't tell anyone on their way to go tell the disciples. This isn't meant to describe to you an absolute silence, it's meant to describe urgency. The women said nothing to anyone as they went to go tell the disciples. So in that way, we make Mark work alongside Luke and John where the women deliver the message. The issue is that saying nothing to anyone when you're writing something down doesn't mean that you said something to someone unless you add an exception, you add some sort of caveat. If you just say that they said nothing to anyone, that doesn't mean they said something to someone unless you add something. So for example, if I said, I never told my wife that I killed a man, that would mean I never told my wife I killed a man until I was 40, unless in that statement I made or that text or whatever, I said until I was 40. And if you read me saying, I never told my wife I killed a man, you wouldn't assume I meant, oh, he probably just means until he was 40, unless that was in the statement. We don't interpret blanket statements, absolute statements, as having exceptions unless those exceptions are given. Otherwise, we're just overwriting whatever the author is trying to say. What makes this an even more difficult interpretation is a couple of specific details. One is that it's not just saying that they kept silent. The author of Mark gives a reason. The women said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So it's not just that they said nothing to anyone, and maybe there's room to add after that on their way to go tell. The women said nothing to anyone, and then the reason that they said nothing to anyone is out of fear. And then alongside that, we have an interesting word choice in Mark, where instead of describing the women as just leaving the tomb, Mark, uniquely to the authors, describes them as fleeing the tomb. The women fled from the tomb. So just going on this next slide, I have Mark, Matthew, and John, and Luke's different verbs used here. In Mark, the verb being used is fuego. I think that's how it's said, which is meaning to escape or to flee away. I don't know Greek, so I'm having to trust what lexicons say here. Concordances, those can always be relatively inaccurate. But Mark is using a word that's very commonly described as not just leaving somewhere, but running away, escaping, fleeing. In contrast to that, Matthew and John, and then with a slightly different word, Luke, use verbs that just describe going from somewhere or returning back from somewhere in some more generic sense. So the women said nothing to anyone because they were afraid after fleeing from the tomb, something that sounds much less like a planned exit to go tell people and much more like a disorganized fear. Finally, we have resolving what the women shared. Did the women say nothing to anyone? Or, like in Luke, did the women talk about angels and a divine message of Jesus' resurrection? Or, like in John, did Mary Magdalene just say that the Lord has been taken from the tomb and we do not know where they have laid him, with no mention of any sort of angels or divine message or appearance of Jesus himself? The harmonizations of this are kind of a smorgasbord of a couple of different things we've already covered. So one, to address Mark, again, Mark doesn't actually mean for you to take away that the women said nothing to anyone. And then to resolve John has Mary Magdalene not knowing about the angels at first because she didn't see the angels before she ran off, like we mentioned before. Mary Magdalene left the other women there. The other women saw the angels and an appearance of Jesus and all these things, but Mary Magdalene ran off first, and so all she saw was an empty tomb. Now, Luke sounds like he's describing Mary Magdalene as one of the women that delivered this message of the angels and their divinity and Jesus' resurrection at the tomb, but maybe Luke is just aggregating what different women said at different times. Maybe at one point, Mary Magdalene went to the disciples and said, oh, the tomb is empty, we don't know where Jesus is. And maybe at a different time, Mary, mother of James, and Salome and others told a message of angels and their divine message. So we're just aggregating different things. Why this doesn't work, we'll go over these couple points here pretty quickly because we've already covered them for other contradictions. Mark says that the women said nothing to anyone. We can't really interpret that as saying that the women told others of the message pretty quickly unless we're just overwriting what Mark says and assuming that he put blanket statements where he didn't. with Mary only mentioning an empty tomb because she left early. As we mentioned earlier, Mary Magdalene is firmly present in both Matthew and Luke as one of the ones who witnessed angels and Jesus himself. And then to address this final argument that Luke is describing what different women said at different times, the writing of Luke doesn't allow for this at all. I just want to read again very quickly and with some emphasis what Luke says in this passage. Quote, "And returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles." So these women returned from the tomb after seeing angels and hearing their message. What did the women share? All of it. What women shared it? Mary Magdalene and all of these other women. Mary Magdalene is firmly fixed there. The author of Luke is describing who told and then also specifically describing what message they shared. And then just to back that up a little bit, and you can go into the document and see the Greek word used yourself, but this word that is used to describe all these things or these things is a word that is consistently only used to describe these things, an aggregate, referencing whatever the subject is. So to interpret this as saying that Luke is describing different women's messages at different times is just flatly ignoring what the author of Luke says. And with that, let's get into layer 2, John Wenham's Easter Enigma. It was my wife's idea to put these hearts, the pictures of the people in the hearts, and that will be the case for all of them. And I think it's a very, I don't know, that just feels very nice. That feels like a good way to approach it. So quick notes about Easter Enigma as a book. The book is focused on harmonizing and explaining every detail of the resurrection accounts with a much broader scope than this video entails. I read through the book and most of it is things that have nothing to do with what we're covering here. Like how far was the tomb from the crucifixion and how far was the tomb from where the disciples were. And when it mentions this woman here, are we meant to read it as the same woman as over here? A lot of stuff that is interesting and worth covering, but not quite relevant to the very narrow scope that I'm sort of drawing here. The geography of Jerusalem, the tomb of Jesus, burial, etc. There's a lot of things covered, much more than just that morning and the women's experience. The book is 125 pages long. It's not very long. Only about 15 pages of that are relevant to this subject. So most of it, again, has nothing to do with this. But I do recommend reading it. It's a pleasant read. It's well written. He's not very Wenham writes in a way that is very approachable, and it doesn't feel too nitty gritty. It's pretty easy to follow, and I like his writing style. I like John Wenham, having read all this. And with that, I'm not gonna say that I disagree with a lot of things he says. Regarding the angel rolling away the stone, so this is pages 77 and 78 of his book, John Wenham says, "On a superficial reading, it would seem that the great earthquake took place after the women had arrived, and that the guards lay prostrate on the ground while the angel delivered his message. But on deep reflection, it becomes clear that it is unlikely that Matthew intended his readers to understand this. Such a notion is contrary to the thrust of the rest of the New Testament." Peter is quoted in Acts 10:41 as saying that God did not make Jesus manifest to all the people, but, quote, "to us who were chosen by God as witnesses," end quote. He was seen by selected witnesses only, not by the people of Israel generally, still less by heathen soldiers. It hardly seems likely that pagans were allowed to hear the first utterance of "He is risen." It is possible that Matthew might have thought that they heard a sound but not the words, as had been the case in an incident that had occurred a few days before, but if so, he gives no hint of it. So, very quickly, first, just a quote from the passage that Wenham mentions here, Acts 10:40-41, "But God raised him on the third day and made him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who had been chosen by God as witnesses, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead," end quote. I don't know quite how to approach this. What Wenham is arguing does not at all follow from the premise he gives. Wenham lays out this premise, and he uses this passage, I think rightly to do so, basically saying, hey, Jesus, when he was resurrected, he didn't just appear to anyone. He appeared to a select few. Cool. Good. Therefore, guards wouldn't have heard an angel say to women that he has risen. That does not follow from the premise at all. If we accept what Wenham said, and we accept that Acts can speak on the Gospels, which, sure, that's fine, and we accept that Jesus and his presence was an exclusive thing, even if we take that as a given, that doesn't speak at all to whether or not soldiers would be able to hear an angel speak. God's presence, Jesus' presence, is distinct and different from the words of an angel or the presence of an angel. And Wenham accepts, of course, that the soldiers can see the angel because that's what blinds them and they become like dead men. So I don't know what else to say here. Wenham is laying out this argument, and I appreciate his use of the scripture here, but the conclusion just doesn't follow. Just because soldiers might not be able to see Jesus when he's resurrected doesn't mean they wouldn't be able to hear Jesus get referenced by a messenger. Reading again from Wenham, he says, "The suggested picture is an incongruous one. The guards lying about like dead men while the women approach the dazzling angel, while the angel delivers his message outside the tomb, while he brings the women into the tomb and instructs them from there, and while the women rush out of the garden. It is better to suppose that, without spelling out the details, he intends his readers to understand that the soldiers left shortly before the women arrived, and that their seeking of an interview with some of the chief priests coincided with the women's reporting to the disciples. In other words, Matthew intends us to understand that the angel rolled back the stone not to let the body out, but to let the witnesses in proof of the resurrection. He sat in awesome splendor of the great gravestone, making it clear that no one could replace it. He sat there to frighten the guard away, and then presumably went inside so as not to frighten the women unnecessarily. He told them that they were not to be afraid." I don't even have much to say here, except that I don't see the incongruity. He starts with that phrase. He says, "The suggested picture is an incongruous one," and he lays out the events. Guards lying around. Angel delivers the message. He brings the women to the tomb and instructs them, and the women rush out from the garden. And this is the thing he says is incongruous. And I do not see what doesn't work about that narrative. In fact, that is how the story reads. And I think it reads in a way that feels plausible. Women are going to the tomb. Angel descends from heaven, rolls back the stone, blinds the guard, says to the women, "Hey, don't you be afraid. I know that you seek Jesus. He's resurrected. He's not here. Go tell the disciples to go meet him in Galilee." That sounds fine. That sounds like it works. If he's arguing that it's incongruous, I don't think it's sufficient for him to just say that it's incongruous. He needs to elaborate on that somehow. And he continues to talk, but the next couple slides of text for him are just accepting that it's incongruous and suggesting what it would be better for us to interpret, which is that the dazzling of the guards and the rolling back the stone is stuff that happened earlier, and that the angel spoke to the women from inside the tomb. So yeah, again, I just want to say that I don't see an argument there. He says it's incongruous, and saying something is incongruous is not the same as it being incongruous. And I feel the need to say incongruous at least a couple more times because I'm on a winning streak here. But if I tell you that doesn't sound right, you drove to the pizza shop and you grabbed pizza and you drove home and you ate it, it's better to assume that you drove to the pizza shop, placed your order, and went home and they delivered it to you. It's like, why? Why does that sound bad to you? Explain that. Anyway, let's read on. Wenham says again, quote, "If this was really Matthew's intention, it may be asked why he wrote so ambiguously. We have to remember that first century writers had to work without the help of such modern aids as parenthesizing brackets, and that, since Greeks care little about relative time, the use of the pluperfect tense was much less favored by them than by us. Often in the New Testament, the aorist tense needs to be rendered by an English pluperfect." So Matthew 28, 2-4 could be rendered in brackets and translated with no impropriety. "And behold, there had been a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord had descended from heaven and had come and rolled back the stone and sat upon it. His appearance was like lightning and his raiment white as snow, and for fear of him the guards had trembled and became like dead men." End quote. Oh, okay, so another slightly scary slide, but you're actually prepared for a little bit of this because we talked about the aorist tense earlier. So he mentions it again here. It is a generic tense in Greek. It is often past tense. It isn't inherently, and it talks about complete actions, things that have happened. They're done. They're over. The past tense, and they're already complete. Pluperfect uses this word here. We haven't covered it much, but that's a term for English grammar that basically just means events that happened before other past events. So for example, if I said, I tried going to the park, but it had been closed. When I said it had been closed, that's the pluperfect. I tried going to the park, but before I went there, it had already been closed. So it's a past tense thing that happens before the rest of a past tense narrative. It's before, right? And so what Wenham is saying here is that given that this aorist tense has a bit of flexibility, and sometimes does need to be translated in this pluperfect way, this past perfect tense, that we could assume that this verses 2 through 4, where it talks about the angel descending and blinding the guards and rolling by the stone, all of that might need to be translated in that way. And based on what we've already covered, you might already see the two problems that I'm going to point out with that. One, yes, verses 2 through 4 are generally in the aorist tense, but so is every verse surrounding them. Verse 1, verse 5, on through the passage, it's all using aorist tense. So the question I would raise is, you technically could render this in brackets, like a parenthetical earlier event, but what is the reason you are doing that for this bit and not for the rest of the passage that is described using the same word tense? And then with that, there's the other big problem. We covered this earlier. Most of it is aorist, but some of it's not. When it says that the angel rolled back the stone and sat on it, and that his appearance was like lightning, both of those are not aorist tense. They are imperfect tense. They are describing things that were not complete, not like aorist. They are ongoing, continuous events in some sense. So it's not just that the angel sat on the stone. The angel was sitting on the stone. His appearance was continuing to be like lightning. And so Wenham is not just excluding from this narrative the fact that the aorist tense is used broadly in the passage. He is also excluding the fact that there are, within 2 through 4, verbs that are not in the aorist tense that deliberately go out of the way to indicate that this wasn't stuff that happened earlier. So I find that quite frustrating, but we'll come across that again later. Reading again from Wenham, he says, quote, "Such a translation, however, exaggerates the elements of relative time in a manner alien to the Greek, or, for that matter, Semitic mind. W. E. Brown, commenting on Matthew's usage, here makes some interesting remarks about the methods of ancient historiography. Quote, "The great historians of the 19th century learned to solve their problems by keeping to a chronological order. Such a practice is strictly speaking impossible unless the narrator is confined to one person or to one locality. Earlier chroniclers had tackled the difficulty in two ways. Sometimes they incorporated in a single story a number of actions and speeches which had a common theme, not indicating at all the time of the occurrence. Sometimes they jumped back and forward between two or more parallel sequences of events, leaving it to the reader to understand that each item is, as it were, a flash on a cinema screen." End quote. We may thus conclude that the earthquake took place before the arrival of any women, and that the terrified guards had already left by the time they arrived. The issue I'm going to take with this, there's a couple of things here, and then there's the quote by W. E. Brown. We're going to cover him in full later in layer 3. So for the moment, I just want to focus on what Wenham said for the most part. But Wenham says this thing earlier. He says, "Such a translation, however, exaggerates the elements of relative time in a manner alien to the Greek, or for that matter, Semitic mind." I could always be mistranslating him or misinterpreting him. What I take away from this is him saying that when we focus on past tense, present tense, pluperfect, which events happen in what order, that we're kind of going outside of the realm of what was expected of authors at that time, and that we wouldn't expect to see a focus on chronology in that way. And if that is what he's saying, I want to take a brief tangent and just look at some of the writing of Matthew, because what will happen right now if you were to go and open up the book of Matthew and read it from start to end is you'll notice a theme in which Matthew very much likes to place his events chronologically and show when things are ending and when things are happening, and after this, then this happened. And to demonstrate that, I'm not going to read through all of Matthew right now, although I recommend it. I'm just going to read through all of Matthew chapter 8. So this is going to take a second. That's okay. We're just going to buckle up, and you could skip it if you want to. But we're just going to read through all of it and notice all of the times in which Matthew grounds his event relative to some other event in the scene, or uses some indication of when things are happening or how, and what speed of time, right? So starting in Matthew 8, chapter 8, verse 1, "When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, 'Lord, if you will, you can make me clean.' And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded, for proof to them. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I am not worthy to have you under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, Go, and he goes, and to another, Come, and he comes, and to my servant, Do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdoms will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion Jesus said, Go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. And when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. Now, when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. And a scribe came up and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Another one of the disciples said to him, Lord, let me go first and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, Save us, Lord, we are perishing. And he said to them, Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? And he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, What sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey him? And when he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men met him, coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time? Now a herd of many pigs was feeding at some distance from them. And the demons begged him, saying, If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs. And he said to them, Go. So they came out and went into the pigs. And behold, the whole herd rushed down from the steep bank into the sea, and drowned in the waters. The herdsmen fled, and going into the city, they told everything, especially what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their region. So I just wanted to read all of that, and you can go over it in your own time too. But when I read Matthew, this chapter as well as the rest, something I see consistently is that he is placing things in a sequence. When he came here, he did this. And then when he went here, he did this. He saw there was a crowd, he went to the other side. When he came to the other side, he saw this. And so to say that Matthew, or broadly Greek or Semitic writing, is disinterested with chronology, at least to the way I'm reading, and I may be misunderstanding Wenham, but to the extent I think I understand what he's saying, I don't think that matters in this context. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's the case that Matthew is generally disinterested with placing things in time. And so for us to say, well, the Greek could be translated in this pluperfect, it might not, but even worrying about that is an artifact of how we currently regard time. I think we see a similar regard for time here in Matthew. And then I wanted to briefly note, going back past the chapter, when W.E. Brown, and again, we'll get to him more later, but when he says that early authors tackle the difficulty of chronology either by incorporating into a single story a variety of actions and speeches without regard for in what order or how or when they happened, or they could flash back and forth between 2 or more parallel sequences of events. I feel that that's a false dichotomy. I think there's a way we could say that Matthew might just be speaking chronologically. It might not be the case that the author of Matthew, when he talks about the women going to the tomb, the angel descending, rolling back the stone, blinding the guards, and then speaking to the women, it may not be the case that he's flashing back and forth between parallel events, and it might also not be the case that he's compiling a bunch of information without regard for what happened when. It might be the case that the author of Matthew is describing a sequence of events. The women went to the tomb, an angel descended and rolled the stone from the tomb, sat down, blinded the guards, and spoke to the women and said, "Don't be afraid," and he gave them a message. That seems very plausible. Continuing on, regarding Mary leaving the tomb early. This is page 83. This will be a relatively brief one. By the time they reached the garden, it was full daylight, and as they approached the tomb, they saw to their astonishment that the great stone had been rolled right away from the entrance. Mary Magdalene at once jumped to the conclusion that the body had been taken. She dashed off to tell Peter and John, leaving the two older women standing there lost for words. This is going to be a similar issue. I don't feel that Wenham is making an argument. He is saying that this is how things might have happened. This is how he's reading it. But he doesn't reckon with any of the issues of that. He just asserts that Mary Magdalene left early, but he doesn't explain why he believes that. He doesn't point to anything in the text to reach that conclusion, and he doesn't reckon with the issues with that. When I read this, what I want to ask Wenham is, if you're saying Mary left early, how do you reckon with the fact that Luke seems to include Mary Magdalene in the group of women, which he actually does address later. We'll get to that too, but it's in a slightly different spot. But then also, how do we account for the fact that Matthew seems to start by describing these two women and then continue to refer to them in this plural throughout the story? And he doesn't account for that at all. He doesn't ever address that. And I find that frustrating, especially because we're taking something that is, in the truest sense, not in the text. When we suggest Mary Magdalene was initially with a group of women, but when she saw that the tombstone had been rolled back, she left by herself. That's literally not in Matthew. It's not in Mark. And it's not in Luke. Now, she does leave after seeing the stone rolled back in John, but when we add that to these other three accounts, it's not there. That's us adding something to the text. So anyway, moving on. Regarding the women's silence in Mark, this is from pages 88 and 89. Mark's version, being supposedly the earliest and most authentic account, and being, according to scholarly consensus, the conclusion to his gospel, has received the greatest attention. It is commonly said that the gospel ends with the women keeping absolute silence, but this is surely absurd. Presumably they said nothing to anyone else, perhaps not even to one another, on the way to tell Peter and John. But clearly the whole story came streaming out eventually. How else could anyone have known it? The meaning of trembling and astonishment may not be so very far from Matthew's fear and great joy. Paul, in an epistle much concerned with Christian joy, uses the expression fear and trembling to describe the devout Christian's attitude to the presence of God. The astonishment or ecstasy may include the idea that the women, though dazed and trembling, were borne along on the wings of an awesome joy. I want to take a little bit of issue with the phrasing here. When Wenham says that it is surely absurd that the women said nothing to anyone, and that they presumably told someone, I just want to note, that's not an argument either. You can't just say that it's absurd, and presumably they did this, if that's not what the text says. He says in that section, but clearly the whole story came streaming out eventually. How else could anyone else have known it? And that doesn't grapple with what Mark says at all. You have an author saying they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid, and your first question is, well, then how do we have the story? Well, that is a fair question, but also at some point we just have to reckon with the fact that the author does say they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. When it comes to how the author has this information, one, if we believe that the Bible is divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit, then the author could have received this narrative from the Holy Spirit. But then two, even if you set that aside, later on Jesus meets them in Galilee and also in Jerusalem. They very well could have asked them, hey, what happened? Did you appear at the tomb? Did the women not see anything? They could be told by Jesus what happened at the tomb. And so there's ways, if you're curious about how the narrative could get there without the women telling the story, it could have happened other ways. The important thing is to reckon with what Mark is saying, setting aside the idea of like where the information came from, which it absolutely could have come from somewhere else. How do you reckon with the story ending with, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid? It doesn't have to be that the women either told nobody ever or said nothing only on the way to the disciples. It may be the case that the women didn't say anything for a long time, or not during the events that are being described, as of opposed to, the stories of Luke or John, where there's some immediate telling, and then Matthew implies the same thing. I've said this earlier, but I just want to note it again. Said nothing to anyone does not mean that you told someone unless you add something to the text. A broad statement doesn't have an exception unless you give it an exception. And I also want to finally note again, we've already covered this, but Mark doesn't just say they said nothing to anyone. He says that they said nothing to anyone, and then he explains why they said nothing to anyone. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So this isn't just something that you can easily tack a caveat onto, because he's already ending his phrase by giving that exception. So I don't find that compelling. Regarding what the women said, this is pages 89 and then skipping ahead to 91. Luke's account evidently telescopes the coming of Mary Magdalene to Peter and John, giving her pride of place in the list of women, and the coming of Joanna and other women to the 11 and to the rest. He shows himself conscious that others besides the 11 were informed. So this is that idea that maybe Luke is describing what different women said at different times, but Mary Magdalene wasn't actually part of the group of women that gave this divine message. When we say that the events were telescoped, they were sort of compressed or expanded or in some way sort of compiled together, that might explain why the contradiction exists, but that doesn't explain away the contradiction. If you have two accounts that don't clash, or they clash in some way, and you say, oh, this one telescoped the events, now we understand why they contradict. But that doesn't mean that they don't contradict. It just means that the author made a deliberate choice that led to a clash between two different accounts. And then again, we've covered this before, but Luke doesn't just say, oh, there was a group of women that told the disciples of what they saw. He says that these specific women, and he names them, including Mary Magdalene, told these specific things, these things that they saw at the tomb, to the disciples. And he doesn't really give an ambiguity there at all. Wenham says, John's full story is in line with a short but disputed account in Luke 24:12. Peter rose and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home wondering what had happened. Again, we're just asserting, we're just saying that John and Luke line up, not acknowledging the ways that they don't, the very different messages that the women give, the different groups of women, the fact that there's an appearance from Jesus in one and not the other. And then with Peter, he suggests that the different accounts of Peter running to check are aligned, but he doesn't reckon with the ways in which they don't. The fact that in John, Peter is running to check the tomb before hearing any accounts of angels, but in Luke, it's immediately after. He's hearing of these stories of angels at the tomb from the women in this divine message, and then running to check. That is a notable difference that needs to be accounted for. And when he asserts that these things line up without even reckoning with those clashes. Regarding the appearances of Jesus, this is pages 94 and 95. There are several indications that the appearances of angels to Mary Magdalene and to the other women were quite distinct. The appearance to Mary was after she had reported to the apostles, to the others before. Mary apparently saw the angels, though not in terrifying brightness, from the entrance. The others were startled by their sudden appearance after they had come inside. The discourse in the two cases is also quite different. Mary is asked why she's weeping. She gives a reply, and then sees Jesus. The other women are spoken to at some length, they make no reply, and they leave the garden without seeing Jesus. The distinctness is shown at this particular point in the story by the subtle change from the first person plural to the first person singular. When Mary told her story to the apostles, she had just left the other women, and could say, "We do not know where they have laid him." But now she is quite on her own, and says, "I do not know where they have laid him." Similarly, the appearance of Jesus to Mary seems quite distinct from his appearance to the other women recorded in Matthew. The first is individual, the second is collective. In the first, Jesus comes up quietly from behind. In the second, Jesus meets them and hails them. The discourse in the two cases is also quite different. Furthermore, superficially at least, there is a striking difference in the way Mary is told not to hold Jesus, whereas the other women do so without rebuke. John's use of the present tense here, however, might be paraphrased, "Do not cling to me." He is not forbidding her to touch him, but giving her a gentle reassurance that she need not fear to leave him, and tell her good news to others, for his ascension to the Father is not just yet. An undesigned coincidence of a very indirect kind may perhaps be seen in Mary's supposing him to be the gardener. Why should she so immediately think particularly of the gardener? Mark seems to provide the answer. They had already discussed the problem of removing the great stone, and probably thought of the gardener or night watchman as the most likely helper. My issue with this section is very similar to a lot of the others that Wenham has covered. There's a lot of writing here, but once again, we're just assuming at the beginning that Mary Magdalene ran off without any accounting for the details around that, without explaining it all. If Wenham wants to suggest that Mary Magdalene left the other women behind the tomb and left early, he can suggest that, but I want to see the evidence for that. I want to understand why that's happening, and I want him to account for the things that seem to push back against the idea. He earlier did try to account for Luke by saying that the accounts are telescoped. I also want to see the addressing of the way that Matthew is bringing Mary Magdalene into the account and then keeping her there for the entirety of it. I want to see that accounting. That's the last of Wenham that I have to cover. I find it frustrating because when I read Wenham, I get the sense that he is very earnestly trying to grapple with those questions. But in so many of these arguments, he barely touches on the actual argument itself. He almost sort of assumes a side of the argument and then speaks as if that is already established, which is frustrating. Layer 3 is continued application. I believe this will probably be the largest section by a long shot. So we're going to cover quite a few different authors with quite a lot of different variety. Some of it will be books, some of it will be web articles, and some of these will be YouTube videos. So there will be a good blend here. And we're going to start off with somebody that Wenham actually mentioned. The First Day of the Week by W.E. Brown is the first book. I could not find a picture of W.E. Brown. I also could not find anything about W.E. Brown. I know that this is an article that he published in a Catholic journal. It was like a little essay that he wrote. And that's all well and good, and we don't need to know who he is to talk about it. But he's an elusive figure, so he gets the mystery face. All right, the first day of the week. Generally speaking, Luke does not follow the method of John. As he indicates at the beginning, he has based his gospel on sources, rather than a collection of them, the historian's method, or at least that of 19th century historians. Essentially, as Collingwood pointed out, it tells us the historian's conclusions about the events rather than the evidence he considered, although it may be cast in the form of a description. It can, of course, give a true account, but it is, however slightly, generalized, and we cannot make the same sort of deductions as we can from concrete, direct testimony. Luke's account of the visit of the holy women to the tomb is of this type. They are mentioned in general, neither named nor numbered. They entered the tomb and found it empty. Later, 2 men in shining garments give them the message of the resurrection, and they return and tell it to the 11 apostles and to all the rest. It does not derogate from the historical truth of such an account if one of the women, Mary Magdalene, did in fact leave the tomb before the 2 men came. Nor does the account necessarily mean that the 11 and the rest, the collectivity of our Lord's followers in Jerusalem, 100 or so maybe, were assembled waiting for an announcement. They may not have been in one house or all together. So the first comer, Mary Magdalene, could have told Peter and John about the empty tomb, while the other women later told of the angelic message to such groups of the disciples as they came across. Nor is there anything against such an interpretation in Luke 24:10-12. Had the account been written by a 19th century historian, these verses would probably have formed 2 footnotes of detail to bear out the general account. The first gives names of the 3 women concerned, without specifying the particular parts they played. The second states that Peter ran to the tomb without saying that he did so alone, as indeed he did after starting with John. Consideration, then, of the manner of writing makes the accounts of Luke and John completely consistent, and I think even natural. Okay, so we're going to chunk up a few pieces of this here. When he says Luke's account of the visit of the holy women to the tomb is of this type, they are mentioned in general, neither named nor numbered. This is technically true. Luke does not start, as some of the others do, by saying, these women went to the tomb. But he's not losing that detail, he's just moved it later into the narrative. So we look at Luke, it starts by saying, the women who had come with him from Galilee followed. And on the Sabbath, they rested. On the first day at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they prepared. So we don't have specific women named or numbered there. But at the very end, it says that returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. So functionally, that's serving the same role. We're still hearing about who went to the tomb, or at least a few of them, and then other women at the end, and what roles they served. It's just not put at the beginning of the phrase. It's put at the end of the passage. So worth noting, he's technically correct, but the same information is provided. He says, it does not derogate from the historical truth of such an account if one of the women, Mary Magdalene, did in fact leave the tomb before the two men came. If that is the historical truth, then Luke's account is incorrect. If Mary Magdalene did in fact leave the tomb before the two men came, then when Luke says that Mary Magdalene is one of the women delivering this message of the angels at the tomb, then Luke is incorrect historically. So he's using this phrase historical truth. I'm less interested with that when we're focusing on contradictions. But if this one is correct, if he's saying that Mary Magdalene left early, then somebody else is wrong. He says the first account gives names of 3 of the women concerned without specifying the particular parts they played. This is just not true. This is not how Luke communicates. Luke says, I'm just going to read it out again, and they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. So they are named 3 of the women concerned, and then the specific parts they played is specified. They told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. So when he says that he's alluding to the idea that there's a vagueness here, and certainly there could always be more detail. We could hear the exact wording they used, but the parts that those women played is absolutely included. Brown continues, Mark's gospel gives us 2 accounts of the first day, though it is possible indeed that both of them are by the evangelist himself. The first, 16:1-8, is written in what I call the witness style, though the writer obviously has only small scraps of the original story. From the incidental question of the women among themselves as they approach the tomb, it would seem that Mark is putting down what he had learned from one of the women, either Mary the mother of James or Salome. She may not have known or remembered that 1 or 2 of the other women were following herself and her 2 companions, nor would she necessarily remember, or perhaps notice, that Mary Magdalene returned as soon as she saw the tomb was empty. But when the remaining 2 received the angel's message, they fled and wandered about for a time, telling nothing to anyone. In our Gospel of Mark, this first-hand narrative breaks off there, either unfinished in our present text, or because it was all that Mark learned from his informant. It is, as far as it goes, consistent with all that Luke and John say, provided we suppose the 2 women, or at least Mary, the mother of James, decided afterwards to take the angel's message to the apostles. So, in here, Brown says, nor would she necessarily remember or perhaps notice that Mary Magdalene returned as soon as she saw the tomb was empty. But again, this detail, I'm not going to retread in the same level of detail, but when we look at Matthew and we look at Luke, this account doesn't align with them. If we are to say that Mary Magdalene is leaving early, we have to account for Matthew including Mary Magdalene through the account, and Luke ending with describing Mary Magdalene as one of the women that delivers this message of the angels at the tomb. Brown says, it is, as far as it goes, consistent with all that Luke and John say, provided we suppose the 2 women, or at least Mary the mother of James, decided afterwards to take the angel's message to the apostles. That works with Luke and John, but it doesn't work with Mark itself. The women said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So if you were to interpret that and say, well, if we suppose that the 2 women, or at least Mary the mother of James, took the message afterwards to the apostles, no, because it says that they didn't. And we have to account for that somehow. You have to engage with that text in some way. You can't just read something that says they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid and go, no, they did. Well, then why does it say that they didn't? Yeah. Brown continues. The objections to the concordance I have suggested look serious when we turn to the account given in the last chapter of Matthew's Gospel, but I think they vanish if we pay attention to his treatment of the time factor. It used to be said that the great historians of the 19th century learned to solve their problems by keeping to a chronological order. Such a practice is, strictly speaking, impossible unless the narration is confined to one person or to one locality in space. Its appearance was obtained by the unconscious assumption of a hypostasized abstraction, a nation or a civilization, which lived through the period chosen, and its failure is apparent when the writers tried to describe the history of a bundle of nations which they called Europe. Earlier chroniclers had tackled the difficulty in 2 ways. Sometimes they incorporated in a single story a number of actions and speeches which had a common theme, not indicating at all the time of their occurrence. Sometimes they jumped back and forth between 2 or more parallel sequences of events, leaving it to the reader to understand that each item is, as it were, a flash on a cinema screen. Any of these methods are historically valid to overcome the problem that the mind can only think of one event at a single moment, and so they are all legitimate for the evangelists. He mentions the fact that describing the bundle of nations called Europe would be quite difficult if you're trying to follow just one place or one person, which is true. And I think there are different ways that might be approached by authors, but that is not at all analogous to the writing in Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. These are not being written in a way that is seeking to describe a complex bundle of nations or some wide group of people. If we look, for example, at the beginning of Matthew, or Matthew 28, that is, we're looking at a narrative that appears to be following, for the most part, this group of women. It follows them until it goes to the guards, who then run and tell the leaders. But we're not following some complex group. So to say that our two options are either that maybe a bunch of actions were bundled together without attention to when or where they happened, or to say that we're flashing back and forth between two or more parallel events, is, or feels to me, if I'm understanding him correctly, that feels like a false dichotomy. It could also be the case that these events are being portrayed chronologically. Brown continues, I think it could be shown that Matthew uses both of the last two methods I've mentioned in different places in his gospel, and I suggest that he uses the last one in his final chapter. In that case, it is composed of these separate items. 1. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary drew near to the tomb at the hour of dawn. 2. There was an earthquake and an angel rolled away the stone, and the guards were terrified. 3. When the women came, the angel gave them a message, and they ran rejoicing to tell the disciples. 4. Jesus met the women and greeted them and gave them a message for his brethren. 5. The guards reported to the chief priests, and their story was arranged. In such a presentation, it does not follow that item 2 is later than item 1, but only that it occurred to a different group of people. So the descent of the angel might, as far as this narrative goes, have happened when the women began their journey or before it. It was necessary to put it in to account for what the women found at the sepulchre. Oh, okay, so Brown makes this a little harder to read than it necessarily needs to be by using this numbered system, but he says it does not follow that item 2 is later than item 1, but only that it occurred to a different group of people. So it's not true that the earthquake and the angel rolling the stone happened after Mary Magdalene and the other Mary drew near to the tomb at the hour of dawn, just that it happened to a different group of people. Setting aside arguments for whether or not this should be read as an order of events or not, saying that it must have happened to a different group of people, that item 2, the angel rolling away the stone and blinding the guards, must have occurred to a different group, is not at all in the text in any way. That's just a thing he's saying. There's nothing in the text that indicates, okay, the women went to the tomb, and then this must be separate from them. The angel descended and rolled back the stone and blinded the guards. There's nothing in there at all. Nothing in the text asserts there was a different group of people. Brown continues, accordingly, Matthew does not say in item 3 that the women found the angel sitting on the stone. His version is quite consistent with their finding the stone rolled back, with the departure of Mary Magdalene when she saw the tomb was empty, and with the appearance of this angel to the other Mary and to the other women who had come up but are not mentioned by Matthew. So when he says that in item 3, that Matthew does not say in item 3 that the women found the angel sitting on the stone, we're not engaging with the things in the text that indicate otherwise. Matthew indicates that the angel continued sitting on the stone when he spoke to the women, at the very least. At a minimum, that's suggested by the use of that imperfect verb tense for when the angel was sitting on the stone and his appearance being white as snow. And he's also the only account that doesn't say that the women found the stone rolled back. If you look at Mark or Luke or John, these accounts mention, there's a verse in there that says that when the women got to the tomb, they found that the stone had rolled back. Matthew does not include that. So there are things here that indicate that the order of events is different from how it's portrayed elsewhere. And then, of course, we brought this up earlier, but we're using that word, behold, that indicates the next item in a sequence of events. Brown is not engaging with that. Further, item 3 does not contradict the statement in Mark that some of the women, including Salome, went away alarmed and told no one. Item 3 only says that some of them, including Mary, mother of James, went rejoicing to tell the disciples. So this interpretation is that some of the women went away and said nothing to anyone, and other women did go and deliver the divine message. There's two quarrels with this. One is that both groups seem to include Mary Magdalene across the texts, and that two is Luke naming Mary, mother of James, as one of the women who delivered the message. Maybe he just believes that only Salome said nothing, which I don't want to say is impossible, but we're splitting down to a hair here in a way that feels very divorced from the way that any one of the particular texts reads. Further, item 4 is not said to happen during that journey. The translation of Major Knox makes this seem to be the case, but with all respect, I think he has interpreted the text. The et essay with which the item is introduced, like the et essay which introduces the earthquake and the terror of the guards, is simply one way, I think a customary way of Matthew, to indicate a switch to a different flash. As far as Matthew is concerned, he has finished the story of the women's journey when he says that they started out rejoicing. But he is still interested in what happened to the women on that day, and presumably was reporting from Mary of James. So he gives us the account of their being met by our Lord at some time during the day, and being sent by him back to the disciples. The concordance with Mark and Luke is then complete. Mary of James and those with her tell the disciples of the angel's message and are disbelieved. Later they are met by our Lord and sent back to the disciples, but arrive this time after Cleophas has gone, and they are again disbelieved, or rather it is thought that they have had a vision. So, Brown says item 4, which is Jesus appearing to the women, is not said to happen during that journey in Matthew. Okay, so just to read from the text. So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings," and they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. So Brown is suggesting that when it says, "And behold, Jesus met them," after saying they ran to tell his disciples, we're now jumping to a different point in the day, that this is something that must have happened probably quite a bit later, after they had already come to the disciples in some capacity. I don't even know what to say. There's nothing in the text that indicates that reading. There's nothing that you would read here to take away from and go, oh, okay. So they ran to tell his disciples, and then when it says, "And behold, Jesus met them and said, Greetings," that must have been something that happened later. You would never walk away with that unless you were trying to reconcile some chronological problem that you've worked up. Again, if our priority is to figure out what the author of the text is meaning, what they're trying to say, this is not something you would walk away with unless you had something else you needed to make the author say. I also want to note that he's talking about this word et essay with which the item is introduced when it says, "And behold, Jesus met them on the road." That et essay is that same word that we translate as behold. It's that Greek word we talked about earlier. The et essay is just the Latin form of it. And he says that it is simply one way, he thinks a customary way of Matthew, to indicate a switch to a different flash. We covered this a little bit earlier, and I, again, welcome you to please go look at the appendix for this later. But that is, I can't stress enough, exactly the opposite of the typical usage of behold in Matthew. When Matthew uses this word, behold, et essay, however you want to refer to it, in his narrative as the narrator, it is used to indicate the next thing in order to the next people almost all of the time. So to look at that being used here and say, well, this is used, I think, in a customary way of Matthew to refer to jumping to something else, a flash to a parallel event. You're writing in a biblical journal. You don't have to say you think a customary way of Matthew. Go check. Go check. Assumedly you know Latin. I assume W. Brown knows either Greek or Latin. He could have checked this before saying he assumed it was a customary way. It does not mean that. He is incorrect, as far as I can tell, with the way that Matthew uses that phrase. I guess that's all that it suffices to say. That's the end of Brown's relevant sections here. He writes in a way that is a bit more obtuse than Wenham, so it's a little bit less pleasant to read. He covers some of the same ideas. What is there to say? This next section covers the book Gospel Women, Studies of the Named Women in the Gospels by the author Richard Bauckham. Richard Bauckham is a biblical scholar, but this book has almost nothing to do, broadly, with the idea of contradictions in the Bible. Generally, it's just about covering the roles of the different women in the different Gospels. Not so much concerned with contradiction, but there's this one section of his book that focuses more on the contradiction of what the women shared, whether or not in Mark the women said nothing to anyone. And so we're going to focus on specifically that section. This book does not read anything at all like the work of Wenham or W.E. Brown. This is a much more narrative book. It's very, very easy to read, and Bauckham is much less focused on the nitty-gritty, contradictory details, and much more on narrative and thematic elements, which you'll see as we read through what he says. Let's jump right into that. Why did the women say nothing to anyone? Mark says it was because they were afraid, but the meaning of this is very much a matter of dispute. One line of interpretation supposes that the women's silence means they do not deliver the message they have been given to Peter and the other disciples. In this way, just as the male disciples have failed, so in the end the women too, who have remained faithful up to this point, also fail. Ultimately, women are no different from men, at least in terms of discipleship. This is the interpretation that entails a finally negative view of the women in Mark, though no more negative than his view of the men among Jesus' followers. However, the proponents of this view seem to me to fail to explain why it is that the women do not deliver the message. What are they afraid of? Awe of the numinous figures in a vision usually leads to doing as they have instructed. Example in 2 Enoch 1, Enoch tells his sons what the angels have told him, as they have told him to do. If, as these interpreters argue, the women's flight and fear are not the expected proper reactions to a revelatory experience, but are to be evaluated negatively, what sort of fear is it that prevents the women giving the message to the disciples? Are they afraid the men will disbelieve and laugh at them? I can think of no better explanation, but the proponents of this view seem to offer none. So, in this section that we just read, Bauckham is making three main points, not even necessarily arguments, but he's making some statements of fact, and I want to go through each of those three. The first is that if the women did not deliver the message, then they are being depicted as disobeying Jesus in a similar way to the male disciples. The second point he's making is that normally, divine figures in a vision leads to obedience, so the women not telling would be odd. And the third is that there does not seem to be a good explanation of why the women are so afraid that they would disobey the angel. Let's go through these one by one. First, if the women do not deliver the message of the angels, they're being depicted as disobeying Jesus in a similar way to the male disciples. This is an argument Bauckham is making, and I think this is true narratively in the book of Mark. In the book of Mark, Jesus tells people not to tell others about his divine nature and his divine works, and people disobey, and people tell others about what he's done anyway. In the book of Mark, Jesus' own family thinks that he's crazy and tries to seize him when he preaches. In Mark chapter 3, 20 and 21, it says, "Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, 'He is out of his mind.'" And then the disciples themselves disbelieve Jesus' nature. They don't understand his parables, and then when he's arrested, they all just flee and scatter. So for the women to end the story by being told to do something, only to disobey and not do that, does match this broader trend, which is what Bauckham is saying, and I agree that makes sense, that tracks. Second, normally seeing divine figures in a vision leads to obedience, so the women not telling would be odd. I don't know that this is a trend that is consistent. I don't think the opposite is true either. I'm about to show examples through Jonah and Numbers and other books of people disobeying divine revelation and visions. My argument is not that people frequently or are expected to disobey divine visions, just that it can go either way. When people have Jesus or angels or God appear to them, sometimes they obey, sometimes they don't. So I don't think we can look at that trend to say that, well, the women probably obeyed at the end of Mark because people normally obey angels. So for example, Jonah 1 is a very, very famous example. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. In Numbers 20, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water." And then later on, "Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, 'Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?' And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly." In Judges 6, then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he rose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be bare on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. In Genesis 19, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought him out, one said, Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And then later on, it says, But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. So in all these examples, people are given a clearly divine instruction, and then to some extent or another, they either flee the opposite way, or they disobey entirely, they don't do what was instructed, or they question the command and don't quite follow to the letter in the case of Gideon. So there is a trend sometimes of people obeying divine visions. I think that there's also a trend of people disobeying or questioning divine visions. So when we look at the story at the end of Mark 16 of the women hearing a divine message from the angels and then seemingly disobeying, I don't think we can say, well, it probably wasn't disobedience because usually people obey these divine messages. It seems to go either way. Another point Bauckham is making, there does not seem to be a good explanation of why the women are so afraid that they would disobey the angel. The main thing I want to note here is that even if there isn't any specific argument of why the women would be afraid that appeases Bauckham's sensibilities or even my sensibilities, it might still be the case that that might be the best reading of the text. If the book ends by saying the women said nothing to anyone for they were afraid, it's possible that even if we don't understand specifically why a character makes a specific decision, that we might still reach the conclusion that that character said nothing to anyone. That might still best fit what the author is trying to say. Aside from that, there are many reasons they could be afraid that are, if not convincing to Richard Bauckham, they're at least plausible in the text. So the women could be, like he noted, afraid of being disbelieved. It could be the residual shock and terror of witnessing an angel. It could be a state of paranoia from witnessing these supernatural events. I think the specific answer is less important than the phrasing of the verse. No matter what it was, what the specific type of fear they were feeling was, it's still the reason that they said nothing to anyone. The women said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Whether that fear is paranoia or shock or sheer terror, no matter what you specifically slot into there, and no matter what specifically is the level to which it's convincing to Richard Bauckham or me or a specific person, that fear, for they were afraid, is the reason that the women said nothing to anyone. Bauckham continues. At first sight, it seems plausible that the women's flight parallels that of the men in Gethsemane, but only so long as we remain at the level of words, instead of envisaging the realistic situations Mark depicts. The flight of the men in Gethsemane is a failure to stand by Jesus, a failure to follow him on the way of the cross, through fear of the danger to themselves. But there is no sense in which the women should have remained in the tomb in order to be faithful to Jesus. Their business in the tomb is in any case finished. The young man has told them to go. Their flight can hardly be a failure of discipleship, even if their failure to speak is. This might be splitting a hair. I don't think it is, but just walk with me for a second. If the women left the tomb and all they did was leave the tomb, that act of leaving doesn't necessarily parallel the men's flight for the reason Bauckham says. Bauckham is correct. The men were supposed to, or could have at least, stayed by Jesus, and that would have represented more bravery and loyalty towards their Messiah. But the women were told to leave. So leaving itself isn't the failure, I don't think. But I think that's a bit of a semantic argument on Bauckham's part. Even if the women were supposed to leave, if they don't deliver the message that they were told to, their failure can still mirror the failure of the disciples, or the male disciples, that is. The male disciples let Jesus down in a moment of need, and the women also let Jesus down in a moment of need, even if specifically the fact that it was a flight or leaving a location, even if that level of detail doesn't parallel, these two narratives can still both be examples of the trend in Mark of people disappointing Jesus and failing to stand by him. Beyond that, though, I'm going to argue that it actually does parallel even on that specific level. And this comes down to word choices in these passages. So if the women left the tomb, there wouldn't be a parallel. But if the men fled Gethsemane and the women fled the tomb, not just exited, returned from, but they fled, there might be a parallel. If there's a fear and a disobedience in each. So the argument I'm going to make, or the evidence I'm going to use for this, is that the Greek word used for fled in Mark 16:8 and 14:50, the account of Jesus being arrested in Gethsemane, is the exact same word. There's the exact same word being used in each of these. So I'm going to go to this next slide. Now, this is the Greek interlinear, so this is a bit hard to read, but I've highlighted the relevant word here in each. In Mark 16:8, and having gone out, they fled from the tomb, and then, they left for fear and trembling it seized them. And that word, they fled, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but it's that word that starts with E-P-H-Y. And then in Mark 14:50, when the men flee from Jesus, and having left him, fled all, it's that same E-P-H-Y word. This is a word we actually mentioned earlier, where in every other resurrection account, the women are returning from the tomb, or leaving or running from the tomb. But in Mark specifically, they are fleeing, this word that indicates a less coordinated exit, an escape of sorts. And so for that word to parallel in these two accounts, I think it's fair to say, if Bauckham is looking for a parallel between these two failures, I think if the women are fleeing from the tomb and the men are fleeing from Jesus, I think it's fair to say that could very plausibly, very easily be a parallel. Bauckham continues. The idea that the women's silence represents their failure is also not really helped by the fact that verse 7 refers indirectly to the failure of the male disciples. The reference back to 14:28 certainly means that the envisaged meeting of the risen Christ with Peter and the disciples in Galilee will entail restoration after their failure. Peter is singled out for mention by name in 16:7 because of his role in 14:29 through 31. But this promise of restoration is not given for the women, whose failure has not even happened when the young man speaks to them. This might seem a pedantic point, but it is important to resist the assimilation of the female to the male disciples that the interpretation of the women's silence as failure promotes. Up to this point, Mark has given the 12 and the women distinct roles, such that the women are still active in the narrative long after the male disciples have fled, effectively out of the narrative. It must be problematic if the women finally have their own failure without their own promise of restoration. Before we do anything else, I want to read the passages that he's referencing in this section. So Mark 16:7 says, "But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And Bauckham is saying that this is a reference back to Mark 14:28 through 31. And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. So through these verses, what Bauckham is saying is that, yes, the men did flee, the male disciples abandoned Jesus, but it was already told to them by Jesus that they would flee. It was also told to them by Jesus that they would return to him, that he would see them again in Galilee. So in this way, Jesus is not just indicating that they will fail, but also indicating that they will be restored to his good graces, so to speak. And so it's not really fair for the men to get this chance at restoration, to be returned to Jesus, but the women have this indicated failure without also being promised some sort of restoration. So Bauckham makes this argument that I agree with here. He's saying that the women, the female disciples, are a distinct group from the male disciples, from the 12. And I agree with this. He's using that to argue that we shouldn't interpret the women as failing, as letting Jesus down at the end of Mark 16, because that would be mirroring the male disciples and their failure. But these are distinct groups. We shouldn't interpret one as failing just because the other did, especially when they are treated differently by the narrative. That might be true, but in the same way, if the women are a distinct group from the men in the narrative, then we shouldn't expect them to get the same treatment. So even if we accept what Bauckham is saying, that the references in 14 and in 16 Mark are referencing that the men not just failed, but will also be restored to Jesus's fold or to his good graces, we shouldn't necessarily expect that to apply to the women who, as Bauckham is saying, are a different group with a different treatment in the story. Just because the 12 get this specific level of narrative care and this specific narrative twist doesn't mean we should expect the exact same thing from the women, nor that we should interpret the story in a specific way as the women actually not saying nothing to anyone because of this differential treatment. I also want to note, and we're going to look at this in the next slide, the women, at least in the book of Mark, don't get the same level of narrative attention throughout the book at all as the 12, as the male disciples. So if the 12 disciples are this main focus in Mark, and I'm going to argue that they are, then we would expect them to get more details, more narrative conclusion and resolution than the women who, again, as we're going to show in a second, don't get nearly the same level of attention in the book of Mark. So this is a slide that I've cobbled together, and each of these different colored dots represents the representation of one of these groups in the book of Mark specifically. So for each chapter, is the 12 mentioned, or somebody in the 12, and are the women mentioned? The reason I put the asterisk next to the 12 is because I'm including either the mention of the 12 as a group, or specific members of the 12. So if Peter is mentioned specifically, or Matthew, I'm counting that as a reference to the 12. And then the women, same thing. So we're just looking at how much representation each of these sort of groups, as Bauckham divides them, is represented in the book of Mark. And you can see that the 12 are a very, very, very consistent force. They're there for almost every chapter of the entire book, with the exception of Mark 7, Mark 12, and Mark 15. The women are also essential to the story, but they only really come into play once the men abandon Jesus. So Mark 14, 15, and 16 are where the women are most present. So looking at this, the men are a much more significant part of the narrative in Mark. Not to say that that's right or wrong, but that's how Mark portrays it. The men are constant. The men are frequent. The 12 are a constant companion to Jesus, and they're a group that he bounces off of constantly. So we wouldn't expect the women to get the same restoration, the same indication of redemption after their failure as the men, if the men are a distinct group, but also a much more primary group in the narrative. So I understand what Bauckham's saying, that it's not, fair is not the right word, but it's not fair that the men get both a failure and a restoration, and the women get a failure and not a restoration. But I don't think that that's grounds for us to interpret this as not being a failure at the end, especially when that failure still matches the trend of Mark generally of people letting Jesus down. And the women are a different group from the men anyway, a much less focused group in the narrative, and so we wouldn't expect them to get that same level of treatment. Bauckham continues. The understanding of the women's silence as disobedience takes the silence in an absolute sense. They never said anything to anyone at all. As Andrew Lincoln points out, this would not prevent Jesus' promise that the male disciples will see him in Galilee being fulfilled, since the promise itself does not include the role of the women in bringing it to fulfillment. In the Gospel of Peter, for example, the women are given and deliver no message, but the disciples go to Galilee just because going home seems the only thing to do. But there is still a problem about taking the women's silence to be absolute. In that case, no one but the women would have ever known the story, and Mark would have never been able to tell it. It is not plausible to read the end of Mark's story of the empty tomb as an ironic device that deconstructs the story's own truth claims. We've covered this argument before with Wenham, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but if the argument is we can't interpret the ending as the women keeping silent and not delivering the message, because otherwise how would the disciples know the story? How would the authors know the story? It could have been the Holy Spirit, or Jesus could have told them in Galilee when he met them what happened. He could have told them, the angel delivered the message to the women, but the women were scared, didn't say anything. So internally, in the narrative, there are other ways that the information could have been found out, so this is not a plausible reason to argue that the women didn't keep silent. Wenham continues, there is no need to suppose that the women's silence is absolute, or that it contradicts the young man's command for them to go and tell Peter and the others. Mark's gospel itself provides a good analogy. In 144, Jesus tells the healed leper to say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest. The general prohibition is not contradicted by the specific command. What the women did not do was to make the news generally known. They did not stop everywhere they met in the street to tell them. They did not tell anyone else, but they did deliver the message as instructed to the male disciples. Before we do anything else, let's read that reference he's making to Mark 1:44. In Mark chapter 1, it says, "And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, 'If you will, you can make me clean.' Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him, and sent him away at once, and said to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for proof to them. But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So using this passage, Bauckham is saying, look, here's another example in the same book of Mark, where someone says, say nothing to anyone, but it doesn't mean clearly to not tell anyone anything ever. So why would we expect to interpret Mark 16 then as using this phrase to mean absolute silence? There are two ways to interpret Mark 1:44. Either Jesus means, say nothing about this thing, but go tell the priest about this other thing. Or Jesus means, say nothing about this thing except to tell the priest. In either interpretation, Mark 1:44 has something important that Mark 16:8 doesn't have that we've already talked about. It has a caveat. It has an exception. In whichever way you slice it, Jesus is saying, broadly, keep silent, but go and talk about this thing, or broadly keep silent about this thing except to this person. Either way, there's an exception in Mark 1:44 that Mark 16:8 doesn't have. Mark 16:8 just says, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid, with no mention of, but go tell the priest, but go and tell the disciples. They went and told these specific people. It is a broad statement, nothing to anyone, without an exception carved out. If I said, I never told my wife that I killed a man, that doesn't mean I never told my wife that I killed a man until I was 40, unless you put in the part where you say, until I was 40. Otherwise, if you read the passage, I never told my wife I killed a man, you wouldn't go, oh, well, maybe he just means until he was 40. The broad statement doesn't have the exception unless you include it. Bauckham continues. In that case, if the women's silence is not disobedience, what explains it? What were they afraid of? On the view that Mark's depiction of the women remains positive to the end, their fear can be interpreted as part of the expected response to an epiphany, continuous with their terror and amazement earlier in verse 8. The whole of verse 8 then describes their reaction to the awe-inspiring disclosure they have witnessed, and Mark's story ends by impressing on his readers this destabilizing and disorienting effect of the message of the resurrection. Lincoln objects that fear is not elsewhere in Mark used in a positive sense of awe in the face of the numinous, but this is not accurate. To take one clear example, it is true that, in the story of the stilling of the storm, Jesus connects the disciples' fear of perishing in the storm with their lack of faith. But the great fear they experience in the next verse is not that unbelieving terror, but awe in view of the divine identity of Jesus disclosed in his command over the elements. This verse alone is a sufficient parallel to a positive evaluation of the women's fear in 16:8. If I knew Greek, I would feel more appropriate responding to any of that. But I don't think I even necessarily disagree with anything Bauckham says there. It may be the case that fear and trembling is more, shock and amazement or awe. But the thing that this doesn't change at all is that no matter how you interpret that fear and trembling and shock and amazement, it is the reason that the women said nothing to anyone. That's how the passage reads. The women said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So we can't use a reinterpretation of the word afraid or, stunned, amazed, to retranslate the reason that that's being given. The fact that they are keeping silent. The fact that the women, as much as we dance around it, said nothing to anyone. Bauckham continues. But it is much less clear that silence is the expected response to a disclosure of the numinous. Most alleged parallels are not really relevant, but 2 Corinthians 12:4 may be genuinely so. Paul speaks there of hearing, quote, things that are not to be told, that no human is permitted to repeat, end quote. It may well be that the women take the words of the young man to be an apocalyptic secret, that they are to communicate to Jesus' disciples, but that is strictly not to be revealed to anyone else. They could well be right in thinking this, in that the time for proclaiming the risen Jesus to the world will not come until he appears to the disciples in Galilee. There is no suggestion in any of the Gospels that any of the disciples, women or men, communicate the news of the resurrection outside the circle of the disciples until the risen Lord explicitly commissions them to do so. I'm inclined to think that this is the most convincing explanation of the women's silence in Mark 16:8. If it is correct, then the last 6 words of Mark actually depict the women as obedient in not betraying the secret to the world. Not only do they remain faithful to the end of the gospel ends by stressing their reverent obedience. First, I want to read from that passage he quotes there. In 2 Corinthians 12:4, it says, this is Paul speaking, "And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter." This, I don't think, is a good parallel to the example of keeping an apocalyptic secret for a certain time or for a specific group of people. There's a huge difference between keeping silent when you are not permitted to speak and keeping silent when told to do something. In the example of Mark 16, the women are told to go deliver a message. There is a world of difference between that and what 2 Corinthians is describing, which is a man being specifically told not to deliver a certain message, a certain concept or idea, things that cannot be told, that man may not utter, in contrast to things that were delivered to the women specifically to be delivered to others. Beyond this, there's this argument that Bauckham is making that the women are being interpreted not only as not being disobedient, but as being reverently obedient to the end. And I just want to note that not only does that not align with what Bauckham himself acknowledges is a broad trend in Mark of people letting Jesus down and being disobedient, but of course it also just doesn't align with the way the passage reads. There is a big stretch between taking a passage that says they fled from the tomb and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid, and interpreting that as, oh, this is the reverent obedience of a group of people. That's all that Bauckham has in this book that is really relevant to this topic. I really, really like the way that Bauckham is writing and delivering this message. I like the focus on narrative. It's very different from the stories that or the takes that we've read before and the ones that we're going to see immediately after this. I like that narrative focus, and it's easy to read his stuff. But I still think that he's straining this narrative argument, this idea that the women should be interpreted as not contradicting these other narratives, not because of the fact that it contradicts, but more because of the narrative details around it and the role of the women and the interpretation of fear. Ultimately, I think all of that is an attempt to reconcile something that is much more easily read, both narratively and in the context of the passage, as effectively the opposite, that the women are in fact being disobedient, that the women are fleeing from the tomb. They're saying nothing because of their fear, that they are in the same way that the disciples did, and in the same way that many others did throughout the narrative of Mark, letting Jesus down. And that might not be a positive message, it might not be an optimistic one, but it does align with what the author seems to be trying to say. This next section is going to be a bit of a change in format. So Wenham's Easter Enigma, that was a published book. First Day of the Week by W.E. Brown, that was a journal article in a Catholic journal. And then Gospel Women by Richard Bauckham was also a published book. This next section is going to be from a web article that was also published in the form of a YouTube video. So this section is called Don't the Resurrection Narratives Contradict by Eric Manning. And this was posted onto a website, I believe, called Testify. And we're going to go through it the same ways we did for the books. We're just quoting verbatim and responding, but you'll probably notice that the formatting is a little bit different because it's following the numbered bullet point fashion that you'd see for a lot of apologetic websites. Historians don't normally conclude that just because individual accounts have apparent contradictions, that the event in question didn't occur. But let's allow that to pass for now. I think the majority of the discrepancies that critics bring up can be easily resolved. Here's a list of the 4 most popular contradictions in the resurrection account that skeptics like to point to. Number 1. How many women were at the tomb of Jesus? And this is me cutting in here. We're actually just going to skip this section because we're not alleging that how many women were at the tomb is a contradiction. So we're skipping number 1. Number 2. Was the tomb opened or closed when the women arrived? But let's reconsider what Matthew says. We're introduced to the passage about the angel by the Greek participle gar. Strong's Greek Concordance defines it as for, a primary participle, properly assigning a reason. In other words, it exists to explain the earthquake and set of circumstances as the women found them. So, to summarize what I believe Eric's argument to be, he's pointing out that in this verse, 28:2 of Matthew, we have this word for being used that is meant to indicate in the Greek the reason for something happening. And so while it might seem like this earthquake and the angel descending and all of this is happening as the women are at the tomb, it might actually be explaining the events as the women found them. That's his quote here. In other words, it exists to explain the earthquake and the set of circumstances as the women found them. I don't think this is true. I also don't think this follows at all. I don't think this is even like a workable argument. The word for being used does indicate that it's explaining the reason for something. I agree with that. And if you read the passage 28:2, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. I'm totally fine with the interpretation that he's giving, that the angel of the Lord descending from heaven and rolling back the stone and all that is being sort of presented as the reason that the great earthquake happened. That's totally fine. Nothing about the word for being used at all implies that this happened prior. There's nothing tensed about that. There's nothing about the chronology of the events implied by using the word for. When you read, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, nothing about that word being used tells you about whether these are present events or past events, and nothing about explaining the reason for something implies that you're talking about something that happened earlier than everything else you're describing, that sort of past perfect tense that we talked about earlier. So I agree with him that for typically indicates a reason. I don't see how that at all connects us to why we shouldn't interpret this as something that's happening more or less in the present tense of the narrative of what's happening to the women. Manning continues. As philosopher Tim McGrew points out, quote, Matthew uses an aorist participle, which could be, and in some versions is, translated with the English past perfect, for an angel of the Lord had descended, end quote. One such translation is Weymouth, which phrases Matthew 28:2 as follows, quote, But to their amazement, there had been a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord had descended from heaven, and had come and rolled back the stone, and was sitting on it, end quote. And here's Young's literal translation, which is about as word-for-word Greek translation as you can get, quote, And lo, there came a great earthquake, for a messenger of the Lord, having come down out of heaven, having come, did roll away the stone from the door, and was sitting on it, end quote. So Matthew isn't claiming that the women saw the angel descend or that they saw the guards get knocked out. It's not in the text. It seems like critics are looking for fault here. So part of this is something that we've actually covered entirely. So when he says, Matthew uses an aorist participle, which could be, and in some versions is, translated with the English past perfect, for an angel of the Lord had descended, we covered all this earlier with Wenham and the others. When you mention that one verb is in the aorist tense, without mentioning that the other verbs around it are not in the aorist tense, you're sort of selecting. So yes, you could translate any aorist tense Greek passage typically as past perfect, but you would, in theory, need a reason to. And you would also need a reason why you're translating that section in past perfect and not every other verb around it. Plus, as we noted earlier, not the whole passage is in aorist tense. There are those two verbs, the angel was sitting on the stone, his appearance was like lightning, that are not in the aorist like the rest of the passage. They're in the imperfect tense, indicating these continuing actions. So when Manning is making this argument, same as Wenham and others, he's not just ignoring and handpicking how he interprets one verb irrespective of the other verbs in the same tense. He's also ignoring the verbs that are in a different tense that directly clashes with this idea that we're looking at events that are sort of pulled out of chronology. Next to this, though, is something that is, I think, a pretty good point and feels like a pretty big challenge. He points out Young's translation, which is a very literal translation of the Greek, which does seem to be translating specific verbs in the past perfect and not others. So reading again from Young's translation here, At the dawn, towards the first of the Sabbaths, came Mary the Magdalene, and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And lo, there came a great earthquake, for a messenger of the Lord, having come down out of heaven, having come, did roll away the stone from the door and was sitting on it. When I read that, that makes me think that Manning might have a point that I don't understand, because having come down, having come, that's absolutely in like a past perfect, pluperfect tense. I don't see a way to dispute that, and this is a very literal translation. So when I first saw this, I think maybe there's something that I'm missing. Young's translation, just to set the stage here, is published first in 1862, and it is, in fact, yes, a very literal translation of the Bible. Here's an excerpt from his introduction to his 1886 revised version, where he stresses just how much he cares about not at all messing with the original text of the Bible. Quote, if a translation gives a present tense when the original gives a past, or a past when it has a present, a perfect for a future, or a future for a perfect, an a for a the, or the for an a, an imperative for a subjunctive for an imperative, a verb for a noun for a verb, it is clear that verbal inspiration is as much overlooked as if it had no existence. The word of God is made void by the traditions of man, unquote. So Young is our guy here. If we're looking to understand what the original Greek meant, or at least what it said, Young is the person who cares the most about not tampering with this. So I trust, at least if he's not misrepresenting himself, the Young is not translating things in past perfect when there's not a reason for it. So this is a good starting point. However, the reason that Young is translating these verbs in this way is not in fact at all because these events are specifically past perfect. It has to do with an entirely different part of Greek translations and Greek phrasing. So let's look back at those verbs and note the verb types in each of these in 28:2. Having come down out of heaven is a participle verb, as is having come, and then did roll away right after that is an indicative verb. So when we have having come down out of heaven, having come, the angel did roll away the stone from the door, we have two participles that are both being translated in past perfect, and then did roll away in a more present tense, or at least not past perfect, as an indicative verb. Now, I'm just going to read what I have on this page here before I sort of add anything to it, because I think this is already dense enough as it is. For Greek, sometimes when a verb is in the participle mood, that indicates that they are inherently connected to the primary or indicative verb, and that they happened before the primary verb. Participle verbs function almost like an adjective verb, and serve to add context or flavor to the primary verb of the sentence. The participle section could be removed from the sentence without damaging the structure, or put in parentheses. So you could phrase it as, and lo, there came a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord, parenthetically, having come down out of heaven, having come, did roll away the stone from the door and was sitting on it. Manning is citing Young's translation as evidence that we should interpret this beginning of Matthew 28 as events out of chronology, that it might sound like the women were at the tomb when the angel was sitting on the stone and all these events happened, but that's actually just a quirk of the way that the author wrote it. And he's using Young as evidence for that, because Young uses this past perfect tense to sort of imply as much. But the reason that Young is using that past perfect tense for these having come down out of heaven, having come, is not at all to do with whether or not all of these events happened earlier, but specifically because the angel having come down out of heaven happened before him rolling away the stone. That's the thesis. It's not because everything the angel did happened before the women arrived. It's because one thing the angel did, having come down out of heaven, happened before a different thing that the angel did, rolling back the stone and sitting on it. And for this reason, Weymouth's translation is actually a bit more confusing, because when he says, angel of the Lord had descended from heaven and had come and rolled back the stone and was sitting on it, he's not actually doing anything to delineate between those participle and indicative verbs in the same way that Young's is. If you read in the plain text that an angel of the Lord had descended from heaven and had come and rolled back the stone, that kind of reads like the angel coming from heaven and rolling back the stone are happening sort of on the same plane of time. And that's not what the text of Matthew is indicating, as Young goes out of his way to demonstrate that these sort of parenthetical use is happening here, where the angel had descended from heaven and had come before rolling back the stone, which is a difference that doesn't really matter much in our plain English, but all of that is to say, it doesn't actually speak at all to whether or not these events happened before the women arrived or not. One last time, I have to apologize. I know this is all grammar stuff. All that you need to take away from this is that Manning is citing something from Young's translation that doesn't actually really have anything to do with whether the author meant for us to read these events out of chronology or not. Manning continues. Number 3, did the women at the tomb of Jesus see a man at the tomb, 2 men, or 2 angels? We're skipping this one again as it's not relevant for this conversation. We're not arguing that that is a contradiction. And then number 4, the women spread the word of the empty tomb, or did they? While the general scholarly consensus is that the long ending of Mark wasn't originally there, what we're not being told by the skeptics is that there's debate regarding whether or not Mark meant to end it there, or if the original text was cut off or left incomplete. The late Bruce Metzger was a biblical scholar and longtime Princeton professor. He thought the original ending was cut off. Why did he believe that? Mark has a pattern of making blanket statements before adding an exception. Just take a look. He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother, Mark 5:37. Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus, Mark 9:8. As they were coming down from the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead, Mark 9:9. Why do you call me good? Jesus asked him. No one is good except God alone, Mark 10:18. Now concerning that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father, Mark 13:32. This is a clear pattern in Mark, so how would we expect Mark to continue if Metzger is right and the text is broken off? It would probably look like what we read in Mark 28:8. Let's combine the two passages. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid, but departing quickly from the tomb, they ran to tell his disciples the news. So here's Eric's argument as I understand it. One is that Mark has a trend of making blanket arguments followed by exceptions. Two is that Mark 16 ends in a blanket statement. The women said nothing to anyone. Three, if we're following the trend, Mark 16 is probably a cutoff where the blanket statement is followed by an exception. I have one very big beef with that argument. It's a relatively obvious one, and it's that Mark also makes blanket statements without exceptions. Mark certainly does make blanket statements with exceptions. That's true. Likely many authors do that. But if Mark also makes a lot of blanket statements without exceptions, then he's just an author using language to communicate things, and it's not supposed to be one clear thematic through line. And I'm going to go through them in just a second, but Mark uses a bunch of blanket statements without exceptions. Mark 2:21 and 22. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed. Mark 3:12. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. And that's not followed by them telling everyone. Mark 3:28 and 29. Truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. Mark 5:43, shortly after one of the examples that Manning brings up. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Mark 8:12, truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Mark 8:26, and he sent him to his home, saying, do not enter the village. Mark 8:29 and 30, but he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ, and he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Mark 11:14, and he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. Mark 12:34, and when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. So, through all of this, there is a through line of Mark giving blanket statements without exceptions after. Are we then to conclude that anytime Mark makes a blanket statement, we should conclude that it has no exceptions? No, because Mark is just an author who is communicating different things at different times. But for Manning to take the fact that sometimes he makes blanket statements with exceptions, say that is a trend, then look at Mark 16 and say, well, that's a blanket statement. It must therefore be cut off and have an exception that resolves the contradiction, it's the epitome of taking something out of nothing that doesn't follow at all. There's no through line there. I want to note something else he said very quickly. Quote, the late Bruce Metzger was a biblical scholar and longtime Princeton professor. He thought the original ending was cut off. Why did he believe that? Mark has a pattern of making blanket statements before adding an exception. If you read this plainly, I think the thing he is implying, I don't think this is controversial, is that the reason he's giving is the reason that Metzger thought that the long ending was cut off. Metzger thought the long ending was cut off. Why did he believe that? ... Mark had a pattern of making blanket statements. That's the phrasing of the article, without the ... Bruce Metzger did not think that for that reason, or at least not that I can find. I've looked through at least 3 different books or articles in which Metzger talks about this subject. I've looked through everything I could find, and Metzger never goes, I believe the long ending was cut off, and the reason is because Mark has a pattern of making blanket statements before making an exception, or even anything along those lines. Metzger does talk about the long ending being cut off. He does talk about why he believes it was a cut off and not the original ending, but this is not the reason he gives. This argument seems to be from Tim McGrew, who Manning links in this article and also in the YouTube video version of this article, where McGrew makes this argument verbatim. I feel that this is implying that Metzger made the argument that the long ending was cut off, and he believes that because Mark has a habit of making blanket statements before giving an exception. But Metzger didn't make that argument. Some other guy did. And now Manning did. Metzger made his own arguments, and it wasn't this one. I'm going to leave that there. I don't want to focus on it too much because that gets less into resolving contradictions and more into whether or not one guy on the internet is dishonest in how he presents arguments. Manning continues, but what if Mark really intended on stopping at verse 8? If you read Mark carefully in one sitting, you'll find a common thread. After Jesus reveals himself in some way, he'll ask the witnesses to keep it on the down low. Quote, then a man with leprosy came to him and on his knees begged him, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. I am willing, he told him, be made clean. Immediately leprosy left him and he was made clean. Then he sternly warned him and sent him away at once, telling him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest, and offer what Moses commanded for your cleansing, as a testimony to them. Yet he went out and began to proclaim it widely and to spread the news, with the result that Jesus could no longer enter a town openly. Mark 1:40-45. They brought him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus to lay his hands on him. So he took him away from the crowd in private. After putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak clearly. He ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. Mark 7:32-36. But you, he asked them, who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Messiah, and he strictly warned them to tell no one about him. Mark 8:29-30. Reading this, we see that there's a pattern of silence, or requested silence, followed by proclamation. The silence never sticks. The whole punchline of Mark is that Jesus is the Messiah. Why we'd expect this pattern to stop seems silly. This argument doesn't make sense at all, for three reasons, which is one, Mark 16 doesn't bring up requested silence followed by proclamation. Mark 16 is, if anything, an ironic twist on that. Mark 16 ends with someone being requested or commanded to deliver a message followed by silence, which is the exact opposite of the examples that Manning is bringing up. Two, Mark 16 works better as an inversion of this trend. So if all throughout Mark, Jesus is telling people, don't talk about who I am, and they do, followed by the ending of Mark, where finally the Messiah's angels tell people, tell others about what happened and the resurrection, that Jesus is alive, followed by them keeping silent. Again, that works more as an ironic twist. It is the opposite of what Manning is bringing up exactly. And three, disobeying Jesus by telling others about his nature is not even a consistent trend in the book of Mark. So in the book of Mark, there are 6 times in which Jesus tells people not to tell others about what happened. That is a consistent trend, but he's only disobeyed 2 out of 6 times, and it's the 2 that Manning just quoted from. So yes, there are people letting Jesus down by revealing his nature and telling others about it, but for us to say it's a consistent trend when it's 2 out of 6 times that Jesus tells others not to tell, I think is a bit of a stretch. That's not really a consistent trend. The trend is Jesus telling others not to tell, and then sometimes they obey, and sometimes they don't. Manning continues. Just think about Mark's gospel as a whole for a minute. In the first half of Mark, everyone questions who Jesus is. In the middle, Jesus questions the disciples' belief about him. The second half tells how Jesus became the Messiah. Mark is making a point about Jesus' identity. Many Jews hoped that the Messiah would overthrow the Romans and rule as king, but as we read his gospel, we see that Jesus came to set up a kingdom different from their expectations. He came not to be served, but to serve and give a life as a ransom for sin. Mark 10:45. His kingdom would start small, but gradually become great, like a mustard seed. Mark 4:26-29. With that in mind, it's possible that the Gospel's abrupt ending is there to intentionally challenge us to decide if we believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Mark could be making the understood assumption that, of course, the women eventually said something. That's why you're reading about this. But what do you think? Who do you think that Jesus is? I cannot, for the life of me, make this concluding argument make sense to myself. There's 3 points that he's making here. And I understand the 3 points kind of in isolation. I don't see at all how they build up to something. So 1, he's saying that Jesus is questioned, then questions his followers, then becomes the Messiah or reveals that he's the Messiah. The second note, Jesus didn't overthrow the Romans as expected and instead was a man of service. Point 3, the ending might be abrupt on purpose to make you think for yourself. I get each of these in isolation. I don't get how any of these, except the third one, speak at all to the ending of Mark, and I don't get how these three build on each other at all. This seems like three completely unconnected thoughts. And with that, that is the ending of the relevant sections of Manning's article. I don't like it at all. I really like Baucham's work. I like Wenham's. I don't think any of these arguments cohere. I don't think any of them make sense. And some of them seem like lies. The thing he does with Metzger, and we're going to talk about Metzger in a second, where he makes something seem like Metzger's argument, but it's actually his and Tim McGrew's, makes me feel gross. And we're now going to move on to Bruce Metzger. And with that, we get to Bruce Metzger himself. This is from one of his commentaries that he put out, titled The Text of the New Testament. And this is much more an analytical book in most ways. And this is just a very brief section of it where he does actually touch on the reasons, at least that he gives, that he thinks that the long ending of Mark has been cut off and that it wasn't intended to end at Mark 16 where we see it. Thus, we are left with a short ending, witnessed by the earliest Greek, versional, and patristic evidence. Both external and internal considerations lead one to conclude that the original text of the second gospel, as known today, closes at 16:8. But did Mark intend to conclude his gospel with the melancholy statement that the women were afraid? Despite the arguments which several modern scholars have urged in support of such a view, the present reader cannot believe that the note of fear would have been regarded an appropriate conclusion to an account of the evangel, or good news. Furthermore, from a stylistic point of view, to terminate a Greek sentence with the word iop is most unusual and exceedingly rare. Only a relatively few examples have been found throughout all the vast range of Greek literary works, and no instance has been found where iop stands at the end of a book. Moreover, it is possible that in verse 8, Mark uses the verb teofluvro to mean that they were afraid of, as he does in 4 of the other occurrences of this verb in his gospel. In that case, obviously something is needed to finish the sentence. Now, he makes a note in this section about how it's inappropriate for him to think that the Gospel of Mark, the good news, would have been ended on a note of fear. I'm going to set that aside because we've more or less sort of addressed it. And then also, I'm not going to go to Bruce Metzger in this case for sort of like the narrative thematic elements of the argument when they've been done already by others, including Bauckham, who we covered. But he makes this argument about the Greek word iop. This is where I need to project, again, as loud and proud as I can, I don't know Greek. And so it makes me very nervous, really, to even cover this material because I am not the person to cover it. And so what I'm going to do here in a second is just reference somebody else's response to Metzger in that biblical scholar world. But I don't know. I know that I'm not even saying the Greek words correctly. I'm not even really trying to. This is not my wheelhouse, and you should not look to me for any sort of insight on the Greek language. Having said that, I'm going to cover what Kelly Iverson said here. So in 2006, biblical scholar Kelly Iverson put out a paper on this specific subject, arguing that the word iop has been found to end not only sentences and paragraphs, but also stories and treaties, and that there is nothing grammatically or historically to suggest that a book cannot end with that word. In other words, the usage of iop as the final word of its sentence does nothing to inform whether or not 16:8 was the original ending. So Metzger is making this argument, as best I understand it, that iop, this specific word in Greek, is just a very, very unusual way to end a Greek sentence or paragraph or book in any form. And so when we look at Mark 16:8, when it ends with this word, that leads us to believe that that's probably not the end of what that sentence was or the end of what that book was. What Iverson seems to be saying is that iop does in fact seem to be perfectly appropriate to use at the end of books or treaties or paragraphs. There's nothing grammatically there out of place, and that there's not really a way that that word can inform for us where a specific sentence or passage or book ends. And then now to quote from Iverson himself, quote, "What the research does affirm is that scholars should use caution in utilizing final iop as a basis for postulating a theory of Mark's ending. Barring significant discoveries of new literature, statistical probability and literal parallels provide little direction in this ongoing debate. The use of final iop from the 3rd century BCE to the 2nd century CE indicates that both theories are possible, but it does not render one theory more probable." I'm sure there's more that could be said on this specific argument by someone else who knows Greek and is familiar with these arguments. I've given enough here that I hope you can see what I've gleaned from it. in that this does not seem to be a foolproof argument from the Greek text, but beyond that, I would just exercise caution. I included this because Metzger is a very well-respected biblical scholar, and I want to note what he says there, and I also want to know what others have said about it. But ultimately, this is the one where, of everything we've covered, I would just want to put up my hands and say, this is not my wheelhouse. I deeply wish I knew Greek. I do not. I'm not going to learn it just for this, not yet. So take in mind what Metzger said. Take in mind what Iverson said. Look into both of these yourself. It's very interesting, if a bit dense reading, but I'll leave it there in this case. Who did the women tell by inspiring philosophy? This is, excitingly, a YouTube video, which means that you're not going to see me reading what someone else said and then responding to it. You're going to see what he said, and then I'm going to respond to it. This is going to be a video reaction format. This is exciting for me. This is fun. This is fresh. We're over 2 hours into the video now, so it's about time to fix up the format. This person is not a scholar, but he references a lot of scholarly material in this, so this actually will be a pretty dynamic and interesting section. And with that, I don't want to give any more, flavor text. Let's jump into it.
It sounds like Mark contradicts the other Gospels, which all report the women went and told the disciples. However, internal evidence within Mark's Gospel can shed some light on what is being said here. For starters, Mark 16:8 may not have been the original ending. Clayton Croy lists 87 scholars who think there was a longer ending to Mark that was lost. A later scribe added the longer ending that we have in an attempt to fill in the missing ending of Mark. Many scholars theorize in the original ending, the women did actually go and tell the disciples, like what we read in the other Gospels. Scholars like James Dunn and Richard Bauckham suggest it must be assumed the women eventually told what had happened. Otherwise, Mark would not have known about it to write it down.
I think it is helpful to know what scholars believe and what their opinions are, but the number of scholars that support an idea, one, doesn't tell us the reasoning with which they used to believe that idea, but also I think more importantly for this case, it doesn't tell us how many oppose the idea. If you can pull together a certain number of scholars that support your argument and you don't show how many scholars disagree with it and disagree with that opinion, then that doesn't really inform much. And then, of course, the idea that the women must have told for Mark to write it down has been addressed. We talked about that. They could have learned it from the Holy Spirit, or they could have learned it from Jesus at Galilee. There you go. That resolved. We did it. Woo!
However, setting this theory aside, there is still internal evidence within Mark that can support the notion the phrase in Mark 16:8 doesn't mean the women literally told no one ever. Mike Licona and Dale Allison highlight Mark 1:44, where Jesus heals a leper, and then Jesus says, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for a proof to them." Jesus tells the man to tell no one on his way to perform a religious task. Likewise, the same thing might be happening in Mark 16. The women are given a task by the angel and told no one on their way to tell the disciples. Licona notes the phrase in Mark 1:44 is similar to the phrase describing the women telling no one. Thus, Mark might not be saying that the women told literally no one, but told no one on their way to bring the message to the disciples. Dale Allison says that this is quite plausible. Just as 1:44 means, say nothing to anyone except the priest, so 16:8 may well mean the women said nothing to anyone except his disciples. In accord with this, Matthew clearly read Mark so that the message entrusted to the women gets to the men without noticeable delay.
So we covered this in the section with Bauckham, and his argument also covering Mark 1:44. If you give a statement with an exception, that's not the same as the blanket statement without an exception. Mark 1:44 has a blanket statement, and then it has a caveat, it has an exception, it has a carve-out. Mark 16:8 has a blanket statement, said nothing to anyone for they were afraid, and does not offer that exception, that caveat. Again, if I told you, I never told my wife that I killed a man, that does not mean the same thing as I never told my wife that I killed a man until I was 40, unless until I was 40 is there. So again, it's very helpful to pull from Mark 1:44 because it is the exact same Greek phrase to an extent, but it's got an exception, and that's what we don't have in the case of Mark 16:8, which is part of what supports the idea that this is how we're meant to interpret it. When we read that the women said nothing to anyone for they were afraid, and there is no exception, reading Mark 1:44 only bolsters the fact that without an exception, this is just a large blanket statement.
Richard Bauckham also draws a parallel to 2 Corinthians 12:4, where Paul states he received divine revelation, but he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Likewise in Mark 9, after the transfiguration, Jesus tells the disciples to tell no one what had happened until after the resurrection. There seems to be a running theme that some divine revelation and miracles were meant to be kept temporarily secret. It may well be that the women take the words of the young man to be an apocalyptic secret that they are to communicate to Jesus' disciples, but that is strictly not to be revealed to anyone else. That the time for proclaiming the risen Christ to the world will not come until he appears to the disciples in Galilee. There is no suggestion in any of the Gospels that any of the disciples, women or men, communicate the news of the resurrection outside the circle of the disciples until the risen Lord explicitly commissions them to do so. I am inclined to think this is the most convincing explanation of the women's silence in Mark 16:8.
This should all sound very, very familiar because this is verbatim some of the stuff that we read from Bauckham in his book Gospel Women, where this is just quoting it and referencing his arguments. However, we're also misquoting it a bit. So he references Corinthians 12:4 as an example of a temporarily held secret revelation, but that doesn't work in this case at all because it's not a temporarily held revelation or secret at all. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. That's not a command to temporarily not say anything or to tell only specific people. That is telling the person in question in Corinthians 12 not to tell at all, to not deliver this thing, to not utter it, to not say it. Now, Mark 9 is closer to what we're looking for. Mark 9 is a temporary secret. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. But like Mark 1:44 before, there's something important in this passage that Mark 16:8 doesn't have that we've talked about, which is an exception. It is saying, don't say this thing until this thing. If Jesus said he charged them to tell no one what they had seen, the way to interpret that text, or at least the plain way to interpret that text that is evidenced in the text, is that Jesus told them to tell no one what they had seen, that was meant to be fully secret. But he doesn't. He gives an exception. Don't tell anyone this thing until this time. Unlike that, in Mark 16, we have the women being told to deliver a specific message, and they say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid, and there is no caveat, there is no exception phrase included, so these do not align.
Now, some might object to this interpretation, because Mark 16:8 says the women didn't tell anyone because they were afraid, not because they were urgently trying to get to the disciples. In Mark 1:44, the healed man was told to tell no one so he could get to the priest. So it is not a perfect parallel. However, Mark often uses fear as the expected response to an epiphany. The whole of verse 8 is essentially describing their reaction as awe-inspired. We see similar language in other places throughout his gospel. In Mark 4:41, he describes the disciples as afraid after witnessing Jesus calm a storm on the sea. In Mark 5:33, the woman with the issue of blood comes to Jesus with fear and trembling after she was healed. In Mark 9, when the disciples experienced the transfiguration, Mark says, "And Peter said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified." This probably refers more to amazement. The way Peter speaks doesn't seem to suggest fear of Elijah and Moses.
We're going to touch on all of this more in a moment as he continues, but just to quickly note, one, he's mentioning that this word for fear can also mean things more like awe and amazement. I just want to note that we'll get into it again more, but this word can also just be used to mean fear in the more traditional sense of afraid. Two, I want to note that there are cues in the sentence other than just "for they were afraid" that indicate that their fear isn't just awe. We'll get into that more again, but the use of the phrasing of the women fled from the tomb, trembling and astonishment had seized them. All of this sort of builds towards a collective idea. And then third, the one thing I want to really focus on is the issue isn't just that they were afraid, it's that the fear was the reason that they said nothing to anyone. Irregardless of what specifically you interpret afraid to mean, it's the reason that the women, quote, said nothing to anyone.
Also, to help support this interpretation, in Mark 16:8, Mark says the women were astonished. The only other time this word is used in Mark is when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, and Mark says they were overcome with amazement. The other term we translate as trembling is often used to mean one ought to be obedient to instructions. So given this context, what Mark 16:8 likely refers to is the women did not tell anyone on their way to deliver the message to the disciples.
A few more notes here. Effectively, what Inspiring Philosophy is doing is he's going through this passage and he's picking out most of the parts that indicate a specific interpretation, and he's saying, but maybe they mean this other thing. So to follow him with this, when we say that astonishment could mean amazement, I don't see how that changes anything. For me, at least, astonishment and amazement are pretty close in meaning. Interpreting trembling as saying that that's something that often indicates obedience, that is true that it sometimes is associated with obedience, but the main thing to note, I think, is that trembling can also primarily mean trembling. Sometimes fear means fear, sometimes trembling means trembling. There might be an association with other words, but they also do mean the thing that they're saying, at least if we trust that the people who translate Greek are, doing their job. And then the big thing I want to note here is that this is a bit of a cobble together. So we're taking these one at a time, but I want to pull them together. So here's the phrase, and I'm inserting his interpretations into the original words. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for obedience and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were awe-inspired. I put it to you that this is not this is not a straightforward reading of the text, and this also doesn't just seem to align with what the text is trying to say. One big thing to note is that he's ignoring the use of the word fled as of just returning from or ran from the tomb. There's this specific word being used that does seem to parallel the flight of the male disciples in Mark 14. Obedience and amazement seizing someone just doesn't seem to align with how we typically use the phrase obedience. Granted, I'm thinking in, an English language, not so much in Greek or Aramaic. They said nothing to anyone, for they were awe-inspired. We're changing as much of the surrounding passage as we can, but ultimately, we still have that phrase. They said nothing to anyone. And whether they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid or because they were awe-inspired, I think does very little to change the core of the meaning. All of these arguments are things that I wish I could get more into the nitty-gritty of, because again, I don't myself know Greek, but I guess the key takeaway I want to impress here is that while he is still ignoring some of the phrasing, the other important thing is that we're changing everything but the most critical part of what we're trying to figure out from this text, which is, did the women deliver this message? And we can change how we interpret trembling or afraid or astonishment. But ultimately, we still have that phrase that he's not disputing at all, which is that the women said nothing to anyone, without caveat and without exception. This next section is another video by Inspiring Philosophy titled, When Did Jesus Appear to the Women? And now instead of focusing on the silence of the women in Mark, now we're focusing on the two different appearances of Jesus in Matthew versus John.
Skeptics will note these two accounts do not chronologically line up and contradict each other in multiple ways. Some Christians respond by trying to harmonize the accounts in a way that preserves all the chronological aspects in both Gospels. Perhaps what happened is the women went to the tomb and found it empty. Mary Magdalene was so distraught, she ran ahead to the disciples, leaving the other women behind. Then the angels appeared to the other women that remained behind, and then they went to deliver the message to the disciples. On the way back, Jesus appeared to them. Meanwhile, Mary, John, and Peter ran to the tomb but took a different way, thereby missing the other women who were looking for the disciples. Then Peter and John left, and the angels and Jesus appeared to Mary alone.
The first thing to note here is that he's not actually claiming this is his solution. He's saying it's a viable solution, and he says that in a moment, but he thinks it might be complex and unnecessary. So taking that as given, that this isn't actually what he's proposing as a solution, it's worth just reviewing for a second the reasons why this doesn't work with the actual text of the resurrection accounts. So in Matthew, Mary Magdalene is there throughout, through the appearance of the angel and his message and the appearance of Jesus later. The author brings up Mary Magdalene and the other Mary at the beginning of the narrative, and then continues to refer to both of them together throughout. It doesn't work in Luke as well, because Luke also keeps Mary Magdalene through the account, through the appearance of the angels and their message at the tomb and telling the disciples later. It was these women who told these things to the disciples. Plus, we have that added wrinkle between these different accounts where in Luke, Peter runs to check the tomb after hearing Mary tell of an angel's appearance, but that would have been after the appearance of Jesus himself in Matthew, but before the appearance of Jesus in John, because in John, Jesus appears to her only after she's run to tell Peter and John, and they run to check the tomb. So we have that extra discontinuity. So again, he's not claiming that this is his solution, but if this is the solution we're putting forward as even viable, even if we consider this workable, the response is that it isn't for the reasons that we've covered.
This is one possible way to harmonize the accounts, but it is complex and unnecessary. Mike Licona suggests a simpler explanation, namely that the Synoptic Gospels have compressed and conflated elements to make the narrative more understandable for their audience. As we noted in other videos in this series, ancient authors were not bound by modern rules of writing. Licona notes ancient authors utilized a number of liberties when writing ancient historical texts. He says, classical scholars have recognized a number of compositional devices that are practically universal in ancient historiography.
That's weird. Did he just... Hang on. Yeah, he definitely just brought up Mike Licona, which means it's time for the Mike Licona Power Hour. Mike Licona wrote a book called Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And the whole point of the book is to argue that a lot of the differences or contradictions between a lot of the different stories in the Gospel are actually just the result of compositional devices used by authors at that time commonly, like Plutarch and others. And so we're going to take a second, we're going to step aside, and we're going to look at what Mike Licona describes as some of the common compositional devices used at the time, and then we'll step right back to inspiring philosophy. I already said most of what's on the slide, but just to very, very quickly review, this is a book from biblical scholar Mike Licona. This guy is a for real biblical scholar. He knows Greek and stuff. And the book's argument is that authors of the time of the Gospels used a lot of these different writing techniques, often in biographies, and they result in differences between different books and stories regarding the same events. And he also argues that those same writing techniques could be applied to a lot of the stories in the Gospels to explain their differences. He calls these periscopes, where he looks at two different or the same event in two different stories and then compares them. And so he takes a lot of periscopes from the writings of Plutarch, who was a writer at the time, and he compares those to the Gospels and the periscopes between those stories to make this point. This is by far the most exciting slide of the entire thing, so just strap in. Transferal, taking words and deeds from one person to another. Displacement, event, moving the event from one context to another. Conflation, combining parts of events or people into one. Compression, I almost used my other hand, portraying events as shorter than they were. Spotlighting, only mentioning some of the present details in an event. Simplification, omitting or changing complicating details. Expansion of narrative details, addition of invented details to fill in the scene, and paraphrasing, rephrasing information in different words. Now, Inspiring Philosophy also covered all of that, or most of that, in his video, and listed those as the ideas that Mike Licona puts forward. But I wanted to introduce this as Mike Licona's idea, because that's going to be important in a little bit.
The point being, ancient authors utilized more liberties when writing down historical accounts. They could reorganize events, modify the chronological order, transfer the words of someone to another, and combine events into one. This does not mean, though, that an author was free to invent entire stories and pass them off as history. They still had to report historical events, but could do so with these compositional devices in mind. J.L. Moles says, if the historian exercises some restraint in the bending of the facts, the procedure is legitimate enough in itself, and perhaps even, to some degree, and in one form or another, inevitable if historiography is to contribute to any real understanding of human affairs. Admittedly, Plutarch puts a lower priority on the initial establishment of the facts than some ancient historians proper, though a higher priority than others. But on the other hand, his manipulation of the facts does not permit invention from nothing. He is therefore a liar, only if truth be held to consist solely in precise historical truth. In other words, ancient authors could rework events, simplify and compress stories, but authors like Plutarch were unlikely to invent entire episodes out of thin air.
So, there are two problems with this argument, and they are both big. We're going to take them one at a time. One, this one's a little straightforward. Literary devices can also be contradictions. Just because something is a literary device used commonly at the time to improve storytelling doesn't mean that it also isn't a case in which two accounts don't agree on the details and only one of them can be true. That's what we say when we mean contradiction. Only one of these things can be true at the same time. So if you as an author displace an event and you take an event that happened in one place and move it to another, you are using a literary device potentially, but also what you are doing is making it to where there are two accounts where only one of them is true. If you were telling a story to people about my brother and the kind of guy that he is, and you took something that I said once and you made it to where in your story, he's the one that said that thing. And it makes sense because he's the one you're talking about, not me. And the thing I said kind of represents him. And so you just wanted to move it around. You might be doing that for a reason narratively, but it's also true that now there's something that's not accurate. There's something that didn't happen. My brother didn't say that. I said that thing. And if one person wrote down that I said it, and somebody else wrote down that Jonathan said it, only one of them's right. The second problem is Mike Licona, and I'm just going to read what I said on the slide. The guy who Inspiring Philosophy cites for his expertise identifying the use of these literary techniques doesn't think these techniques work in this instance, and says so in the very book that Inspiring Philosophy uses to cite him. So we talked about that book. We had the Mike Licona Power Hour. There's the book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels?, where Mike Licona uses those periscopes. He compares two different versions of events, and he hypothesizes about how different literary techniques could explain why those differences are there. We're going to read from some of the other sections of that same book here. Mike Licona says, the story differs in Matthew 28, 8 through 10, in which, upon hearing the message of the angel at the tomb, the group of women, which included Mary Magdalene, left quickly with fear and trembling and ran to tell Jesus' disciples. At minimum, it appears that either Matthew or John has relocated the appearance to Mary Magdalene. This shows the extent to which at least one of the evangelists or the sources from which they drew felt free to craft the story. Moving forward a couple of pages, he says, we have observed a number of differences in this periscope. Although many of them can easily be understood in light of the compositional devices we've observed being used by Plutarch and the evangelists elsewhere, there are several that leave us bewildered. 1. The location where Mary Magdalene first encountered the risen Jesus. 2. Jesus' message to Mary Magdalene. 3. Whether there were women at the tomb during the initial visit by the women. 4. The number of Jesus' male disciples who were present when Jesus first appeared to them. And 5. Whether Jesus first appeared to the male disciples in Jerusalem or in Galilee. It is of interest that all but the first of these differences can be resolved quite easily if John's Gospel were removed from our consideration. So to summarize, Mike Licona does believe that these compositional devices, these literary techniques, can explain a lot of the differences in those stories. But in relation to this specific story, the resurrection accounts, he believes that there are some differences that can't be explained by his model. And the first one he names is the different appearances of Jesus to Mary Magdalene. With that, that's all that I really wanted to cover from this video. I think the big things I want to hammer home at the end of this is that literary devices may explain some of the differences in the Gospels and in the resurrection accounts, but something being a literary device does not mean that it's not a contradiction. And Mike Licona, the very guy that is being referenced here as the inspiration for this idea of literary devices, doesn't agree that it explains these actual, situations. And he says as much in the same book that Inspiring Philosophy was citing. And with that, we are done with all of layer 3. Layer 4 is much, much briefer. It's notable arguments in brief. What we've just finished doing is taking people and taking everything they had to say on this subject and quoting it verbatim in full and going over it more or less exhaustively. And now we're going to just take a few things that people said in different sources that I thought were worth bringing up because they were notable in some way or another. I thought there's a point to be made there, but we're not going to quote them verbatim. We're just going to take the notable piece of each and talk about them. The Resurrection Accounts in the Gospels is an article published by Corey Anderson. He's a pastor, and I just wanted to talk about a section in which he tries to explain the different appearances of the angels in different books. Anderson writes, Mary Magdalene leaves the other women at the tomb and returns to the disciples to tell them that they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we do not know where they have laid him. After Mary departs, the other women encounter the angel that rolled away the stone. The angel tells them, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. His invitation is to come see the place where he lay, and once you have done that, they are to go quickly and tell the disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you in Galilee. There you will see him. Lo, I have told you. His invitation is to look into the tomb. At this point, the women enter the tomb, and they did not find the body, but they did encounter two men, angels, and they also saw a young man. We are told that the two men stood by them, and the young man they saw sitting on the right side. I find this notable because it is both, to me, a technically workable explanation of the events of the morning, at least in terms of the appearances of the angels, and something I don't think most people would accept as the intention of the authors. His argument is effectively that the women didn't see one angel or two angels, depending on, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, which one you focus on, but that they saw four different angels. They saw one outside the tomb and then three more inside. One that looked like a young man and two that looked like angels, two standing side by side and one sitting by the tomb. It doesn't still account for John, but he would argue that the events of John and the appearance of the angels then happens later just to Mary Magdalene. I think there's a level on which I could say that this is an explanation that functions. Like, if you accept that it's just different angels every time, then that would account for the difference between Matthew and then Mark and Luke. So I think that's workable. But this is why, to me, it's important not just to figure out if something is a logical contradiction in the sense of, do these things actually physically in the universe preclude each other, but also, does this contradict with what we believe the intention of the authors to be? Do we believe that when Matthew and Mark and Luke wrote their story, that they all knew or could have known that there were four angels there, but they all chose to spotlight just one or just two each? And this idea of spotlighting is used elsewhere. People will defend the fact that some narratives bring up one angel and some bring up two, as saying that some authors are spotlighting. They're just focusing on one angel. They're not saying that there isn't two there. They're just saying that they're focusing on one. And I think that's technically workable. But when you bring it to this point of there being four angels, technically it could be spotlighting, and Matthew and Mark and Luke are all just specifically choosing distinct and separate parts to spotlight. But I don't think most people would accept that as what the author of any of those individual gospels actually intended for you to take away, or their representation of what happened that day. Barnes' Notes on the Whole Bible by Albert Barnes. This is a very, very, very old biblical commentary, and I'm just going to read a tiny excerpt from it. As much difficulty has been felt in reconciling the accounts of the different evangelists respecting the resurrection of Christ, and as infidels have maintained that they are utterly irreconcilable, it may be proper, in closing the notes on Matthew, to give these accounts in one view. With these principles in view, which are conceded to profane historians always, let us look at the accounts which are presented in the sacred narrative respecting the resurrection, appearance, and ascension of Christ. We're not actually covering in this video what Barnes presents as the unified, harmonized order of events, because everything he brings up has already been brought up by Wenham or Brown or Bauckham or somebody else. This just stood out to me when I was reading through everything, because it's just a very notably non-scholarly or academic tone. When I was reading through, looking for different sources and arguments, it just really took me out of it to read the opposition referred to not as skeptics, not even as atheists, but as infidels and profane historians. I just found that fun, and I just wanted to note it because I think it's fun. Also, a fun fact, this commentary was published in 1862, and also fun fact, in 1846, he also wrote a 400-page book detailing the Christian case against slavery. He wrote 400 pages in 1846, right around the turn of the abolition of slavery, arguing why Christians should not support the institution of slavery. So, he called others profane and infidels, but he also was firmly anti-slavery, and I think that's really cool. This is an article from the apologetics website Got Questions, titled, "Can the various resurrection accounts from the four Gospels be harmonized?" In the battle with skeptics regarding Jesus' resurrection, Christians are in a no-win situation. If the resurrection accounts harmonize perfectly, skeptics will claim that the writers of the Gospels conspired together. If the resurrection accounts have some differences, skeptics will claim that the Gospels contradict each other, and therefore cannot be trusted. It is our contention that the resurrection accounts can be harmonized and do not contradict each other. I want to push back against this argument as firmly as I can, because they're doing something a little misleading here. They're making it sound like it's an either or, but what they're phrasing is not the actual either or. So they're saying either, if the Gospels all agree and are word for word the same, then skeptics would just say that they all, colluded with each other and it's all just basically one account. That's true. If the Gospels were one for one the same, and each, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you open each one up and they're verbatim the exact same thing, of course, everybody, not just, atheists or agnostics or skeptics, everybody would agree that's just one book. But the flip side is not a one where there's differences, because differences are fine. Differences legitimately do enhance the credibility of stories. Opening up Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and seeing what differences are there is good and does bolster the idea that 4 different authors wrote 4 different books. But that's not the same as there being contradictions. Contradictions are not differences. If there are differences between the 4 accounts, that's great. And that doesn't mean anything for inerrancy. Inerrancy could still be on the table, because they could all still be true. They could just highlight different things. They could bring up different details. They could all be talking about Jesus, but tell different stories, which to an extent is what the Gospels do. But if there are contradictions, not differences, but cases in which only one of the 2 things can be true at the same time, it was daytime, it was nighttime, only one of those can be true at the same time for the same event, then you do have a case against inerrancy. It doesn't mean it's not historical. There might still be historical truth in the account, but it cannot be called perfect, because if there's things that aren't true in it, it's not. Next, we're covering a portion of a video from Mike Winger called 13 Bible Contradictions Refuted, Evidence for the Bible.
It says in Matthew 28, "Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it." You're probably seeing the solution already. The solution is Matthew records that it happened, but doesn't say it happened after they arrived. This is just wishful thinking. In fact, the only time indicator in verse 2, "Behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended," past tense, "from heaven and came and rolled back," past tense, "the stone and sat on it." This is all past tense, and then it talks about the guards' shock and surprise, and it talks about what that angel said to the women in the same passage. This is just wishful thinking. I'm like, do I really have to explain this?
We covered this already in a different account, but I just really need to dwell on this for a second. It drives me crazy that you're bringing up that these 2 verbs are in past tense. Oh yeah, when the angel descended from heaven and rolled back the stone, those are past tense verbs. Yeah, they are, but I know that he can check the same things I can. I know that he has access to the same tools I have. And I know that because my tools are things I'm using that are free, and I am uneducated on the subject. So if I can look and notice that not only are those 2 verbs in the potential past tense, but that is the verb tense of the passage. It's also the verb tense of the part where the women went to the tomb. It's also the verb tense of the part where the women left the tomb to go tell the disciples. And when Jesus appeared to the women, it's all in the same aorist tense. So for you to go, well, this is something that happened earlier because these verbs are in this tense. They all are. So why are you interpreting them selectively and differently? Why are you taking 2 of them and going, well, I must interpret these differently from the rest? On what grounds? Why? Why are you doing that? And then even again, that we've already covered all this, but he's also not mentioning the verbs that are different. When the angel was sitting on the stone and his appearance was like lightning, those are those 2 imperfect verbs that indicate something that's continuing and ongoing. And that's right before he talks to the women. So it's crazy to selectively point out which verbs are in the aorist tense. And it's also crazy to ignore what verbs aren't in that tense. And that's all. I just had to get that out there.
So did they go to tell the disciples, or did they say absolutely nothing? Dead men tell no tales, and they decided to say nothing. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Which one was it? This on the surface seems like a bold contradiction. It does. It appears that way. This is what we call an apparent contradiction. But here's the solution. Here's the solution. They told. Like, how can you say that they told when Mark says they went out and they didn't tell? Well, they had to, or Mark never would have known. Right? I mean, think about this for a second. Does Mark intend us to think they never told anyone, not even me? I only know about this because of God's, revelation to me. Does Mark write that way? Mark writes as the account of Peter communicated to Mark and faithfully recorded. So it writes as factual, historical, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, eyewitness accounts. It's not written as a revelation of supernatural knowledge. So in context, Mark should be read to say, well, they obviously told someone eventually, or he wouldn't know that they even knew. It'd be secret. So how do I reconcile then Mark 16:8? Here's what seems to be the case. They didn't tell anyone while running back to town. They didn't run out and proclaim it to everybody. They ran just to the disciples and they told them.
It is the epitome of telling the Bible what it's allowed to say. To read a passage where it says, they said nothing to anyone, without caveat, without exception, and then go, here's the solution. They told. Why did Mark bother writing anything? If Mark can write something as blanket and extreme as the women said nothing to anyone for they were afraid, only to have it bulldozed, then what is the point in writing it? And what is the point in claiming that you take the Bible seriously? Anyway, I put these ones in here so I could vent a little bit on points that I tried to stay more level-headed about earlier. This part was just catharsis for me. Thank you for indulging. And with that, all that's left is closing thoughts. This is everything that I think is worth saying, but I didn't want to add all of it to the beginning, so I'm just going to cram it all back here. A few thoughts just left on inerrancy and why this all matters. And the first thing I want to focus on is the idea of the plain text versus the nitty-gritty. I think one of the things that somebody might react with when they read all of this and all the details about, verb tense and the intention of the authors is that we're missing the forest for the trees, that we're getting too focused on what does the specific word mean, what does the specific phrase mean. We're missing the big story. And I think the big thing I want to emphasize here is that this is not just something that only exists in the nitty-gritty. If you read this story in the plain text without getting into any of the translations or tenses or anything, these issues, most of them still exist, and most of them are still obvious and evident. You'll notice the fact that there's different numbers of angels at the tomb, that Jesus is appearing in different places and in different ways, and that Mark ends with the women saying nothing to anyone. Now, you can scope in, you can zoom in and see the micro and look at all the specific details and dig into it. And you will also see that on that level, the contradictions are still there. Those clashes still exist, that there are still ways in which these stories don't agree with each other. But it's not just on that nitty-gritty level. Whether you zoom out or not, in either case, these are stories that clash and contradict with each other. Given the fact that they contradict in those ways that we've already established, I think it's also worth looking at some of those details that don't necessarily clash and think about what the authors actually had in mind when they wrote their stories. It isn't inherently a contradiction that some of the accounts have one angel and others have two. It's not inherently a contradiction that some accounts have some women there and others in other accounts. But if you already know that these accounts disagree on some of the details, it's worth reassessing and looking on that macro level and thinking about, did the authors actually have the same women in mind when they wrote the story? Were they just choosing to spotlight, Mary, mother of James, or Jeremy, or Salome? Or did they truly just not know about everyone that was there? Or were they writing from different sources, or with different ideas, or manufacturing different details? I know this is something I've already mentioned a couple of times, but I want to focus on this idea of inerrancy versus historicity. Not everything about inerrancy actually clashes with the idea that an account is historical. Just because there are differences and clashes and contradictions between Matthew or Mark or Luke or John doesn't mean that there's nothing truthful in those events. Everything I've said in all of this could be true, and the resurrection might still have happened. The argument of inerrancy versus whether or not it's flawed or not doesn't speak at all, really, to whether or not the resurrection or anything else in the Gospels exactly happened in one specific way. It's just speaking to whether or not the Bible, or at least these Gospel accounts, are perfect, flawless sources, which, isn't a standard we apply to any, other book or account. But because there is this divine and religious significance to the Bible, there is that focus. So I just want to make sure that I make clear that I'm not attacking the historicity in this video. That's not the focus at all. The focus is, do these accounts agree or do they disagree? Is everything in them true? And if it's not, we can still look for what is true in them, but we can't go into it assuming that everything in it is true. This is going to take a little bit more time. This is a larger topic, but I want to briefly entertain the idea that the Bible doesn't even claim to be inerrant. This is something I assumed going into this, and I assume that the Bible says that it's perfect. And growing up in a more fundamentalist Baptist background, that's also something that I took as a given, that of course the Bible claims to be perfect. That's just part of it. But I don't believe that that's the case. I'm going to go over now a couple of the verses that are used to bolster that idea and just spend some time on them. But I think it's important that if the Bible doesn't claim itself to be inerrant, then that is an idea that is truly just introduced by people, by humans, that is something that we've taken as a concept and decided to apply to the Bible, whether or not it even claims that about itself and whether or not it's even true. Starting with 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. There's two big things I want to note here. One is that, and this is going to be a through line for several of these, but when it says scripture, it's not necessarily clarifying what it means. So the author writing 2 Timothy, assumedly Paul, might have in mind the Old Testament or the Torah or some specific group of texts, but that doesn't speak to whether or not it includes the text that they are writing themselves or other books in the New Testament or the Gospels. And that's one point that is broadly applicable. But more specifically here with 2 Timothy, it uses this phrase, God breathed, that the scripture is breathed out by God. And that is the phrase on which inerrancy is rested. I put it to you, at least based on my understanding of the Bible and its theology, that just because something is God breathed does not speak to whether or not it is perfect. And the big thing that jumps out to me when I think about that is us. It's people. It's humanity. We are God breathed. That doesn't mean that we are perfect. We, in theory, were perfect when we were created, but there was the fall, and we now live in a world of things that are still created by God, but are no longer perfect. So if we are looking to something as being breathed out by God, if it's true, let's just take for a moment and accept that all scripture is God breathed. It's breathed out by God. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It just means that it's from God. And something can be from God and have goodness in it and not be perfect. At least that's my understanding. Second is Psalms 12:6. The words of the Lord are pure words, like silver refined in a furnace on the ground, purified 7 times. This is even more vague. It's not even saying scripture. It's saying that the words of the Lord are pure words. And we might take this for granted now, but the main thing I want to focus on here is, are we talking about the words of the Lord in the sense of the word of God, scripture, the Bible, or literally the things that are said by God? And how do we, looking back on a text, determine that? John 17:17. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. Again, a big question. So God's word is truth. Let's take that as a given. Does God's word being truth mean that the words of Paul or the words of James or the words of John, are those God's word? Are they as true and as perfect as the words that are said by God himself? And how do we establish that? We can claim any number of different stances on that, but importantly, John itself doesn't clarify that. That's not something claimed by the author. 2 Peter 1:21, for no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. This is an account that I read being used as an example of the inerrancy of the Bible, but I don't think 2 Peter is even claiming that. It says, for no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but I don't think anybody would consider all of the Bible to be prophecy. There's bits of it that are explicitly not. There's bits of it that are historical. There's bits of it that are more prophetic. There's bits of it that are more poetry. There's bits like the Song of Solomon. So we can say that all prophecy was produced by the will of man. That doesn't necessarily tell us which parts of the Bible fall under that umbrella, or even which parts of things that people have said that aren't in the Bible are held under that umbrella. Lastly, we have Titus 1, verse 2. Paul, a servant of God and apostle of Jesus Christ, for the sake of the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth, which accords with godliness in hope of eternal life, which God, who never lies, promised before the ages began. And again, this is something we focused on a bit more. I'm including this because it's one of the ones I saw referenced a lot, but I don't even think Titus is speaking to the same thing as the inerrancy of the scriptures here. There's a difference between God himself lying and texts authored by men having errors. Those are two things entirely. Unless there is something that I'm missing or misinterpreting, I don't believe that the Bible is even claiming to be without error. I think that idea that the Bible is incapable of containing errors or disagreements or two things that don't see things the same way, I think that's a human invention that we have applied to the Bible, not one that is being taken from the Bible. In that way, the idea of inerrancy is not just incorrect, but it's also telling the Bible what it ought to be saying, instead of starting with the text and moving forward from that foundation. I could have focused on this at the beginning, but I don't think most people are going to view this as the most important thing unless they're people that are focused on the logic or philosophy of things above all else. But I put it to you that something being a contradiction is something that almost never exists in the real world. When we say something is a contradiction, it means that two things cannot be true at the same time. And in the world of logic or math, it's probably really easy to come up with that. One is not the same thing as two, boom, a contradiction if you claim that one equals two. I think we have one level of fuzziness even talking about the present day in events that happened today or yesterday or are going to happen in a moment. But there's even another level of fuzziness when we're talking about texts that were written in a different language a long, long time ago. And I just want to go over some examples of why I think this is an important distinction, that we don't just consider contradictions in a logical sense, but also in considering what the authors meant when they said it. So for example, I could read two different accounts, two different newspapers or something, where one says that the building in question was completed in 1939, another says it was completed in 1944. There you go, straightforward contradiction, right? Well, no, we can push up our glasses to go, well, maybe that the initial floor plan was completed in 1939, but then there were renovations that were completed in 1944. Boom, contradiction busted, the accounts are harmonized. Or you could say in one account that Jeremy was 5'11", another account that the same Jeremy was 5'7". Boom, contradiction, right? Well, actually, maybe one is talking about when he was younger, but now he's grown taller. So he was 5'7", but now he's 5'11". You could say, I could read two different accounts where one says he left for work that day in the early morning. Another says he left for work that day a bit before noon. That, in theory, is a contradiction, but maybe one of them is talking about the first time he left for work, and then later he came back for a lunch break or something, and then he left back for work later on. So all of these are silly, but I'm trying to make the point that if you really, really want to, you can make anything not a contradiction in the real world because there's that room for fuzziness, unless something is said very, very, very specifically. To read from Corey Anderson, who we talked about a little bit earlier, he said, "The law of non-contradiction states that something cannot be true and not true at the same time and in the same context. For example, the coffee mug I'm using this morning is black. It would be a contradiction for us to say that the coffee mug is black and then to say that it is not black. When we apply this to the resurrection accounts, we find that some offer up as contradictions are nothing more than differences in detail, and they do not qualify in logic as genuine contradictions." I think Corey Anderson is probably correct. There's a lot of things people probably put forward as contradictions that can't be literally proven as such. In fact, we talked about that with his account earlier, where he suggested that instead of there being one or two different angels at the tomb, that there were four. There was one outside, and then two that looked like angels on the inside, and one more that looked like a young man, and the two were standing by the tomb and where Jesus was laid, and then one was sitting down. All of that might be true in terms of true logical contradictions, but I don't think that's what we're even looking for when we're talking about narrative. For example, take even the example that Corey Anderson used. He said that it'd be a contradiction to say that the mug was black and not black. But I don't know, maybe the mug is black on the outside and it's not black on the inside. Or maybe it's like a dark gray that's not only some people would consider black. Or maybe it changes color with the temperature. They have those mugs where maybe it's black, but then when it gets hot, it turns orange or something. So even in the example that he gives as a perfect airtight contradiction, we have that fuzziness, and that exists because we're in the real world. So when we're looking at these contradictions, I think it's important not just to look at, well, can this thing literally be proven physically impossible? What we should be looking for, or at least for me, is what do I think the author meant? Do those things disagree? Did the author of Matthew mean that Jesus met Mary Magdalene on the way back from the tomb? If that's what he meant, and John meant that Jesus met Mary after not seeing any angels at the tomb, later on while back at the garden after Peter and John had run to check, if you and I agree that Matthew means this and John means that, even if we can conjure up some magical explanation beyond what seems plausible to explain those two, if it clashes with what the author means, using our best discernment, we would not view that as a valid harmonization. And lastly, this is the last slide out of, I think, over 160. We are there. It's why it matters to me. I'm not going to focus on this too much because I don't think it's as important as, whether it's true or not. But obviously I have an investment in inerrancy being an incorrect doctrine. And I want to dwell on that at least a second. I think the first thing is, and this might be a little bit cutesy to say, but I think it just is the case. And I think if something is true, even if you don't have a particular investment in it, I think that should be noted. So the first reason that I care about it is because it appears to be true. Second, and this also might go without saying, but I think that inerrancy is, and in the past has been used to justify countless evils in the world. And I don't have any interest in defending the doctrine that led to all those countless evils. Inerrancy has been used to justify slavery in the 1800s. It's been used to justify marital abuse and domestic violence. It's been used currently, actively, to justify treating gay people and trans people as lesser than other people. That's not something that just has happened. It certainly was worse in some ways in the past, but that's active, that's present. And a lot of the reason people feel comfortable leveraging the Bible against all these different groups, against, black people in slavery, against gay people, against trans people, against women, is because they believe and they tell themselves that the Bible is perfect. The Bible is a flawless cudgel to use because everything in it is morally righteous. And to an extent, there might be a case where even if the Bible isn't inerrant, maybe the Bible really does stand by those doctrines. But I think it's important to distinguish the Bible as not being some holy and above everything else document. If the Bible is imperfect, and I believe that it is, then whenever people use it as that cudgel, it needs to be reflected on. There has to be that level of introspection. It can't just be taken as a given. I think alongside that, another reason I think it's important is because inerrancy does decrease that critical engagement with the Bible, with that text. If the Bible does have disagreements between authors, that is something that's interesting, that's worth noting. If some authors believe that salvation can be lost and others don't, or they believe that faith is by works and others don't, if that's true, if that's what the Bible is saying, if that's what those authors are trying to depict, that's worth knowing and that's worth investigating whether you're a Christian or not, but especially if you're a Christian. But if you have this overlying doctrine of inerrancy that tells you that everything you read has to be made to agree, then you don't get to look at those differences. You don't get to examine them. You have to ignore that part of your Bible, in theory, the most important document in some people's lives. You have to ignore that facet of it entirely. I think the last reason I want to note for why it matters to me was my own personal journey with my faith and the role that inerrancy played in that. Because I was raised believing that the Bible was perfect, and that was a big part of my faith. Why do I believe in God? Why would I tell people that? What were the apologetics I used? Part of it is because we have access to the one and the only perfect document in the universe that comes straight from God, and everything in it is authored or co-authored and co-signed by Him. And realizing over time that that wasn't true, that the Bible isn't perfect, that it's not flawless, was something that pulled me away from that faith because it was one of the reasons I gave myself to believe it in the first place. If the Bible isn't perfect, if that is the case, then people shouldn't be telling themselves that, and they shouldn't be teaching it to others. That's building a poor foundation on which to build their own belief, and it's also preventing them from exploring perhaps the more true reasons for them for why they have that faith. It might just be a spiritual relationship with God. It might not be resting on believing that you have the one perfect document in the world. I think that's all I have to say on the subject. I don't want to over-summarize. I don't want to say too much. This is long enough. I hope you enjoyed watching. I hope this was in some way helpful and informative. And if it wasn't, then you just wasted over 3 hours of your life. And that's on you. Bye-bye.